Losing your job to AI sucks, but what adds insult to injury is losing your job to an AI that can't do it unless it's doing war crimes. It's built by incredibly stupid right-wing billionaires who want to create God to enslave it and don't care if they blow up the planet or the economy. It's enough to make a man turn to drink. So, let's do that. Cheers. Welcome back everybody. As you can see, I've put on my serious explaining clothes to lend as much gravity to this occasion as I can and convey the maximum amount of authority, because this is the AI video. If you're new here, well, welcome. I usually talk about books, but from time to time I feel the need to yell about something else. If you've been here for a while, well, I've been promising this video for over a year, so yeah, this is it. Settle in for 4 hours of me rambling. Anyway, before we move further into this video on artificial intelligence that I've been promising since last year in May, and well, I want to answer 3 important questions. Why is this? What is this? And how is this? So let's do that, shall we? So, why am I making this video? See, well, for a while now everyone is talking about artificial intelligence in every single area of the world for all kinds of reasons. Is it a bubble? Is it going to commit war crimes? Is it going to take my job? Should I use it for writing, art, or anything else? Is it going to take over the world and turn us all into paperclips? Do we know the answers? Well, at least for the war crime stuff, we do. Anyway, so at some point, this whole thing came to the area that I usually spend time in, which is, of course, people talking about books. And obviously, everyone is talking about, can it create art? Is using artificial intelligence in book production, in writing, in cover design, in editing, in anything? Is that okay or not? And people have strong opinions on that, and I respect that. Unfortunately, also, people have less well-informed opinions on the subject, and that kind of made me angry. And then I thought about it for a moment and realized, well, the problem is artificial intelligence is a huge fucking concept, right? There's a lot of different things going into that. There's the economics, there's the computer science side, there's the, well, cultural side, there's the philosophical side, all of these things. And while, you know, people may assume that there's something not completely fine going on, they might still use it to create thumbnails because they feel, well, what can one individual do wrong by using Midjourney once or whatever? And that lack of information is not necessarily their fault, it's just because, you know, there's just so many different weird things going on. And then I thought some more, and then I realized that, well, I have a degree in computer science. I did, in fact, write my thesis, which is really bad, don't get me wrong. It's not a good thesis, but I did write it on artificial neural networks, which is, you know, the thing driving the current large language model paradigm of artificial intelligence. So I kind of know what's going on the technical side. And then I realized, well, I did, in fact, study philosophy and even started a PhD in philosophy. I have read, you know, texts on consciousness, on theory of mind. I've even read texts on aesthetics, on, you know, creating art, the philosophy of art. Well, that's pretty good, right? I've also read an awful lot of science fiction and fantasy, so I know all the texts that, you know, all of these people right now talking about AI are using as examples, and I can tell when they're wrong about what they're saying, right? So I might just be in a very specific position where I can, in fact, talk about a lot of aspects of this whole large, convoluted mess that is artificial intelligence with some level of, you know, knowledge. So I decided, I guess I'll have to do that. As I've said before, spite drives a lot of my projects. So that's why we're doing this. So what is this going to be? Well, it's going to be a video about artificial intelligence. When I say artificial intelligence, it will cover several steps. One of them will be, what is it that we talk about when we say artificial intelligence? One will be, what is the current paradigm of artificial intelligence? What is it going to do? What can it do? What can't it do? Why is it really not that impressive? Why is the thing that we're currently in a bubble? And why is the project at its core, unfortunately, well, eugenics driven by a bunch of, well, right-wing billionaires, mostly. And what can we do about it after all? Because we need to do something about it. So that's kind of what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a quick introduction that hopefully allows you to then read further and inform yourself further on individual details that you're interested in to make informed decisions on how to, position yourself versus the current version of generative artificial intelligence, how to interact with your boss when they forced you to use it, how to interact with people who are using it and tell you that it's fine, and so forth. That is the goal of this video. It's going to be a relatively long introduction into all of this. It will not cover the most current situations and developments in the saga of OpenAI, XAI, Anthropic, and so forth, because, as I said, I've been working on this for over a year now, and things change over time, and if you want to learn more about those kind of things, I would recommend checking out, Ed Zitron over at Where's Your Ad as a newsletter, or the Better Offline podcast, or Cal Newport, who's a computer scientist who knows what he's talking about, or check out what Gary Marcus is saying at this moment. There are people you can check out who are doing the day-to-day reporting and are much more competent at that specific thing than I could ever be. Check out those for that. This is a higher level introduction kind of thing. Think of it almost as, an audiobook or a series of lectures, or one massive ass lecture. That's the goal here. So let's move to the final question here, which is, of course, how is this going to happen? Well, in several steps. As you can see from the runtime, this is like about 4 hours of me rambling. That's a lot. So before we move further into this, I want to preemptively answer a question that a lot of people have asked me in the past, which is like, why don't you do individual shorter videos? And trust me, this would have made my life much easier. I've thought about this. The reason I'm not doing it is that the whole complex of artificial intelligence discourse right now is connected. Explaining how the technology works is one part. Explaining how the specific technology does foster a very specific problem with venture capital, with the investment in innovation, and how that has led to the bubble that we're in right now is a second part. Seeing how there are ideological drives behind this specific trend that has, tied all of these things together is another part, and explaining how, our reading of and their readings of science fiction have poisoned and destroyed the conversation in a lot of ways is another part. They're all tied together. And if I make 20 videos about this, chances are you will not watch all 20 of those, just like the ones that have the cool title where I talk about how Elon Musk is a Nazi or whatever, right? And that will be bad, because you will then not be able to understand where my argument comes from. So I have decided to make this one long video. There are obviously timestamps. You can skip around if you want to. But this is an ongoing argument where every single part is the basis for the next part. The final argument builds on all of the stuff I have said before. And that means you kind of should listen to all of it in the correct order to get all of these arguments, because I don't want to constantly, explain stuff again. So that's why I decided to do one large video, which took me, a year to record. So that's the first part here. The next part is, of course, how is this going to be structured? Well, it's going to be very clearly structured. We talk about the history of artificial intelligence technology and automation in the first part. We'll then move to the current paradigm of connectionist artificial intelligence, large language models, and so forth in the second part, where I explain the technology that is, underlying the stuff that everyone is currently calling AI. After that, we'll move forward to look at, the actual capabilities of this technology and the costs that come with that. That's the part where we'll talk about what they can do, what they can't do, and, how much of it is based on stealing artworks, how much of it is based on, burning down the planet and all of that kind of stuff. Once we've figured out all of those things, we have to ask the next question, which is, of course, so why is anyone doing this? Which is where we talk about venture capital, startup culture, Silicon Valley, and how it has all turned into a massive bubble. And once we've established that, we will move on to the next part, which will be looking at the idea of superintelligence, how it is tied to eugenics, how it is tied to a very specific form of right-wing ideology that is prevalent in a group of people in Silicon Valley right now that have been driving the current artificial intelligence bubble in a lot of ways. And once we've established that, yes, this is what is going on, and they are all fascists, we'll have to look at how, Nazis in particular, right-wing people in particular, white supremacists in particular, are reading science fiction, are explaining science fiction, are using ideas brought forward in science fiction to further build up their specific ideology and shape AI discourse. That's the next part. After that, we know the shape, we know the lay of the land, we can finally come to that final question of this video, which is, of course, now that we know that everything sucks, what can we do to actually change things? That's hopefully where this will end, with me giving you some sort of hopeful pointers of where to go next. That's the structure. It's a lot, trust me. So before we actually get into all of that, a couple of final sort of like notes, and then we're done. The first one is on language. See, a lot of AI discourse right now is heavily anthropomorphizing artificial intelligence. We talk about Grok says, we talk about ChatGPT is thinking, we talk about Claude is apologizing. That is dangerous. Anthropomorphizing these machines is incredibly dangerous and makes a lot of conversations much harder. So even though this can be linguistically somewhat troubling, I have tried to usually talk about models that take inputs and turn them into outputs. We have to be very clinical about this. We have to be very careful about this, because these are software models that are built as products by companies. Responsibility ultimately lies with the companies that produce these things and put them out on the market, not with the models. And we need to be clear about this responsibility if we want to actually change how things are going and want to shape the future. This is really important, and I urge you to try the same in every other conversation. I know it kind of sucks, but we kind of have to do this, otherwise things are going to get much worse. So this is the first part about language. I may not have always succeeded, but I try my best. All right, the next important thing is, of course, sources. Well, I have used a lot of sources. I've read a ton of books for this and a ton of papers, and I've tried to put all of them in a long bibliography down in the description. This is the first way of doing this. You can see all of those sources down below. In addition to that, at the beginning of each individual segment, I will give you a quick rundown which sources I've used for that specific segment, with a sort of quick judgment of which of those are, I would think are the most important ones, the most readable, most accessible, and where to go next if you want to dive deeper into each of these individual sort of segments and learn more about that. That's how I've handled sources, and the reason for this is, of course, the final part that we need to talk about here. If you're new here, I am blind. I can't do a lot of editing, and I can't read quotes individually. I can't do, cool sort of like citations on the screen and everything, because I'm editing all of this on my own on a fucking command line, which is a deal, right? So I decided to go about it with the sources this way, so now you know. And if I should by accident say something that is word for word the same thing as it is in a book, I'm not trying to steal anyone's sentences here. I'm not trying to plagiarize anyone. It's just that I've read certain of these sources so many times that some of the sentences may have just stuck. And that's also why I don't have like a lot of good individual quotes in there. I can't read them, so unless I can't remember them in one, sentence, they're not in there. So that's the final part here, and it hopefully also explains why I may stumble over words from time to time. I'm not reading a script. This is all fucking improvised in, so many re-recordings over an entire year, and I'm very happy that it's finally done. The final part, yes, I am, not dressed in a very formal way. The reason is, I'm kind of sick of, visual presentations, and if you need me to dress up in a shirt to believe me and not, look at the sources down below, I can't help you. This is how it's going to go. I hope me being a bit more casual does make this a bit more accessible. If I fail, I fail. And with all of that out of the way, let's actually get into it and learn a bit about artificial intelligence. So, at its core, artificial intelligence is just a marketing term John McCarthy made up to fuck over Norbert Wiener. But before we can get there, we need to cover our basics. So, welcome to part 1, the automation game. Cheers. Well, this is the part where we talk about automation theory and the beginnings of artificial intelligence, all the way to, the sort of fading of the symbolist artificial intelligence paradigm. This part is mostly based on the following books, and these are a lot. There is Matteo Pasquinelli's The Eye of the Master, A Social History of Artificial Intelligence. I highly recommend that one, especially for bits on automation and so forth. It also covers a lot of the connectivist artificial intelligence, so it will come up later again. It is also based on Power and Progress, a book of the struggle of innovation and wealth by Darren Acemoglu and Simon Johnson. I do recommend this one. I mean, Acemoglu won a Nobel Prize, so there's that. It's another book on innovation and where the profits and benefits of innovation go. It is also based on A World Without Work by Daniel Susskind, which looks at automation and what it does to, well, labor in a lot of ways. It is also based on The Empire of AI by Karen Howe, which I highly recommend. In general, it covers mostly contemporary artificial intelligence and OpenAI. It is also based on Atlas of AI by Kate Crawford, which covers most of the same elements, just not as focused on OpenAI as The Empire of AI. And technically, it is also based on The Technology Trap by Carl Benedict Frey. I would caution about this one, however, because while it covers similar ground as A World Without Work and Power and Profit, Power and Progress, it is, well, Carl Benedict Frey is the Dieter Schwarz Associate Professor for Artificial Intelligence and Labor in Oxford. And, well, Dieter Schwarz is not only the boss and owner of Lidl, but also the boss of a company that builds data centers for artificial intelligence in Germany. So Frey's very positive outlooks on artificial intelligence when it comes to labor are somewhat suspect to me. I just wanted to bring this up. I have read it, and it does cover a lot of the same things. It's just more positive on the effects of AI than, say, A World Without Work, which is still fairly positive. So these are the main sources for this part. So let's talk about automation and why it matters. So for starters, automation means replacing human tasks with machines that can perform those human tasks. That's our starting definition. We will get from there to other parts, but we need to look at something, and that is, how do you actually do that? And well, you start doing that even without machines. See, in 1776, a terrible year all around, two things happened. A couple of colonies in the north of America got upset about taxes, started a rebellion, something that has been misinterpreted and used to justify any number of atrocities ever since. And a guy in Scotland wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, talking about Adam Smith, a book that has since been misinterpreted and used to justify any number of atrocities. I wonder if those things will come back together later. But we'll start with The Wealth of Nations, where Adam Smith looks at something, and that is division of labor. He does so with a relatively famous example of a pin factory, where he explains that if instead of one laborer making one pin, and then making another pin, and then making another pin, and every laborer doing that, it would be more profitable, it will raise productivity and so forth, if each laborer would just perform the same task that is part of building a pin, whether it's drawing the pin, whether it's creating the head and so forth, over and over again, and thus only having to do one thing. They can optimize in that regard. That's basically the fundamentals of division of labor. You take a complex task and you break it down into smaller subtasks, and those are then done by individuals who are, well, focusing on one specific task. It does increase productivity in a lot of ways. And it's something that humans have always done. It just got sped up once automation entered the picture. However, you don't need actual machines to do exactly that. You can do something else, and that is just have humans do that. One of the places where a lot of this was started and, well, perfected in a lot of ways was, of course, slave plantations in the Caribbean for sugar, and, of course, later on slave plantations for cotton, where division of labor was already done to the uttermost maximum. Why is this important? Well, that's where we come to the important element here. If you divide labor, you need one person who knows how the whole project works and who can, assign those tasks. The people performing those tasks don't necessarily need to know all of the things that go into the whole job. You are expropriating knowledge from individual people and reducing them to just one physical task. That's one of the big problems. This will come up again and again and again. So if you want to automate labor, a division of labor is the first thing that you need to do. You, subdivide into smaller and smaller tasks, and if you then can build a machine that can actually replicate one of these smaller tasks, then you can, replace that specific laborer with a machine, or, and presumably someone who has to, operate the machine, which may be a different skill or no skill whatsoever. And thus you can, over time, automate an entire process of production. That is how automation works. All right, so how do you actually build said machines that take over specific tasks? Why, you observe, dare I say, surveil your laborers, look at how they are performing a specific task, you take measurements and so forth, and then you replicate that in a machine. That's literally how that works. And that's the point here, right? Because what you do is you expropriate knowledge, because before that, your laborer knew how to do a specific task, and you obviously also had the physical ability to perform that task. You know, it's swinging the hammer and knowing how to swing the hammer. And you expropriate the knowledge of how to swing the hammer and put that in a machine. After that, you just don't need that person, or that person doesn't need that knowledge anymore. This is important. See, if we assume that there are employers, we can call them capitalists, and there are, employees, we call them labor, or laborers, right? Well, both sides want to get the maximum out of their relationship, right? They negotiate for wages and so forth. If you are the employer, the capitalist, your goal is to pay your laborers as little as possible, because you want to maximize your surplus value. And labor is the one thing that is very flexible, where you can negotiate, because machines cost a certain fixed amount of money, it's a fixed capital, resources cost fixed amounts of money, and so forth. Labor is where you can negotiate. Now, what is it that you as a potential laborer bring to the table when negotiating with your presumed boss about how much money you are worth? Well, your ability to swing a hammer, maybe, or still your physical labor force, but what is more important is your knowledge of how to do the task. And the more complex and more complicated and difficult the task is, the more knowledge it requires. The more you can ask for it, because presumably there are fewer people who can do the same job. That's, why we go to universities. That's why we do complex skill training, because that makes us more valuable and gives us more power when negotiating our jobs. Anyone can press a button, but it's much more complicated when more difficult jobs come in. So if you are someone who can actually expropriate that knowledge and put it in a machine that then belongs to the owner, the capitalist, the employer, you can then, you have then a much larger group of people who need a job, and they need far less training, so you can push down wages. That is a fundamental benefit of automation in a lot of ways, and that is at the heart of most of the things that are going on with stuff like artificial intelligence today as well. So that's why we needed to start here. So what can you do as a laborer to work against that if, your bosses are starting to automate more and more parts of your jobs? Well, I'm glad you asked. That's what happened in the early 19th century, late 18th and early 19th century in England, when first power looms were invented, and, steam looms and steam frames and all of these other wonderful machines that helped speed up fabrication of cloth. At the time, Britain was very much a cloth producing country. So, those weavers and other parts of the cloth trade, they organized. They started to help each other out in mutual benefit associations, and at some point they started talking to the factory owners and said, hey, we'd still like to have a job. We know stuff. We produce superior quality materials and so forth. So maybe don't use the cheapest labor and use the cheapest and exploit the cheapest labor, which is kids, and don't use those machines, or at least still pay us a living wage. Obviously, employers said no, and then people started boycotting those factories, and when that didn't help, they started breaking into those factories and smashing machines, and obviously still worked with those factory owners who came to make deals with them. That's what this was about. It was not about, destroying machines as such, or hating technology. It was about finding places to finding a way to, negotiate the introduction of technology. If you want to read a really good book about that, and I forgot to mention it earlier, Brian Merchant. Blood in the Machine is a history of the Luddite uprising and comparing it to contemporary struggles, labor struggles in technology. I highly recommend you read it, and I highly recommend you follow Brian with his blog of the same title, where he interviews people who are now replaced by AI machines. So, really good book, Blood in the Machine, take it. So, the Luddite uprising, it, was really successful until something happened that will happen again and again and again, and that is, of course, the state stepped in. Britain really wanted to keep those jobs, well, not those jobs, but keep those factory owners happy for, the usual reasons. They are wealthy and all those connections. So Britain sent its army to Nottinghamshire and around that. It was the largest occupation the British army had ever done until then. And that is the point. Whenever these labor struggles come to pass, capitalists, the owners of the means of production, will seek an alliance with the state, the provider of the monopoly of force. Keep that in mind when we're talking about AI and its closeness to current governments, right? Another thing that is really important to understand here is that if you raise the production, the amount of production, right, the productivity, you need more resources. That is also important. You speed up everything and you need more resources. So with the introduction of machines in cloth production in the 19th century, the demand for cotton rose. Luckily, someone invented the cotton gin, which automated the preparation of freshly plucked cotton into, so it can be spun. And that means you need way more cotton. How do you do that? Well, by increasing chattel slavery, of course. I'm bringing this up not just for a gotcha, but it is really important to see that there will always be groups of laborers that suffer from that increase in production on the lowest rung of that. We will come back to that with artificial intelligence as well. So that is the fundamentals of automation. Now, here's where computers come in for the first time. In the 19th century, there is a man called Charles Babbage. You may have heard of him. He invents a machine. It's the analytical engine. Well, it's the difference engine. It can calculate logarithms, and it's driven by a steam machine. It's basically the first almost computer in that regard. We've had machines that could, compute simple things manually before, but he automates it by, hooking it up to a steam engine. He's very famous. Everyone knows about him, and everyone knows about his associate Ada Lovelace, daughter of Lord Byron, who wrote the first actual computer program in that regard for the analytical engine, which was never fully built, and is thus often considered the first computer programmer. Now that is kind of right, but there has already been a form of a computer program before that was highly successful but not seen as such, and that is, of course, the Jacquard loom. It's a loom that is fed punch cards that determine the pattern, or the color pattern in the woven cloth, and it's highly successful, and punch cards were taken as a medium to store information ever since, all the way into the 1950s and 60s. What is important here is that since cloth production is seen as a lower class kind of work, it is not seen as work of the mind, and thus the kind of things that people like Ada Lovelace with her program to calculate Bernoulli numbers did. That separation of labor is also really important because it once again shows that this is a class issue in a lot of ways. It's used to separate specific tasks that are seen as higher in value than others, and what with cloth production already being seen as lower class, possibly gendered labor in a lot of ways, the Jacquard loom is not seen as a proper computer in that regard. Obviously, it's not a computer, but it does execute programs. Anyway, so throughout the 19th century, all of this progresses, right? We see more and more machinery that replaces individual tasks. The division of labor gets, escalated more and more, and there is something that happens, like the more you divide labor up, the more you need to surveil labor to then optimize it further and further. That is, of course, the concept of scientific management, or also known as Taylorism, that reaches its first peak around the year 1900. What is important here is, once again, that by surveilling and restricting labor, like the human part of labor, more and more to maximize the efficiency of these machines, something important happens. And that is, the machines take over the main effect, the schedule of work in a lot of ways, and humans become the mere appendages of machines. Karl Marx writes about that. In case you want to read it, read Capital. It's a good book. But there is a word here that we need to keep in mind, and that is centaur and reverse centaur. See, if a human uses a machine or a tool in one way or another, we call that a centaur. You're in charge, you're using the machine, a piece of software, whatever, to do something, and it enhances your capabilities. You are the human part of the centaur, the machine is the horse part. Once the machine takes over and becomes the more important part, we talk about the reverse centaur, and it's obviously in the interest of employers, business, capital, to turn as much of the labor force into reverse centaurs as possible, because they control the machines, but they don't necessarily control the humans. Well, unless we talk about reverse centaurs, where suddenly, through controlling the machines, they also control the human labor. These are really important things, and these are still ongoing. What we need to look at, however, is a slow shift from automating and mechanizing mostly physical labor and physical performing work to automating mind labor, all kinds of calculating, thinking, and so forth stuff. Now, this has also been done in the past, basically before Charles Babbage created the difference engine. The method of differences was already used during the French Revolution to also calculate tables of logarithms by separating them out into individual tasks where people did just calculate one specific difference and hand all of those back to someone who assembled the whole thing later on. We are already building algorithms in that regard by just using humans to do that. Interestingly enough, most of that labor was done by women, who are once again sort of like vanished from that narrative, often because we focus on that one high upper-class lady with all the romantic charms of being the daughter of Lord Byron, and kind of forget that a lot of like basic calculating tasks were always done by women and children sometimes. So we have already done that. The problem is that we haven't really figured out as humans until the early 20th century how human minds work. We have theories about that. People like Leibniz, for example, are already starting to build machines like that, or try to work about how to formalize thinking in a lot of ways, but we don't really get that. The 20th century is the century where we move forward for all kinds of reasons with the study of the human mind, and thus questions of intelligence come up for the first time. That is one important part. The other important part is here, however, a switch in logic, right? So the difference engine works. It works really badly. And one big problem there is that it uses the decimal number system. The switch to binary numbers is a huge deal, because binary numbers can be replicated by electronic circuits and anything of that sort, because you have a 1 and a 0, or like current or no current, and that can replicate the entirety of your of language that you need to do something. That is a big deal that drives forward computation and ideas of how to automate functions of the mind in a lot of ways. Now, we need to talk about something here for a second, and that is how to drive what drives information, innovation, and research. And there are basically three drivers, right? There is business interests. That's a lot of what drove innovation during the 17th, like 18th and 19th century, and a lot of, automation in particular. That's business interests, like how to increase productivity, that kind of stuff. So people will invest in better machines and tinker around to build better machines. That's something that happens a lot during that time. Then there is, of course, academic research. It's blue sky research. So people are just like trying to figure out how the world works and don't necessarily think about mechanical applications they follow afterwards. That happens far less often during the 19th century, but with that switch on like understanding how the mind works, we are moving into that area. And then there's, of course, the third one, that is, of course, military funding. The interest is like how to make better weapons and so forth. And since that isn't driven by profit motives directly, it's a third type of innovation. So we have this slow switch from sort of mechanical first, business-driven innovation in the 19th century to a more academic-driven form of research in the early parts of the 20th century, and we shift from there to a military-driven one during the, mostly World War II, and then obviously the Cold War. What this also means is that language changes, right? There is something really important when it comes to innovations. We build machines, and those machines then further our abilities to research, to create theories, to explain why these machines work. And once we have these theories, we can then use that app to build even more better machines and move forward. So it is a constant dialectic between practical innovation and machines and creating the language that then allows us to build more machines and so forth. That is sort of tied to that, and you can see the connection between business and military on the one hand and academia on the other side and hand there. All right, anyway, the 1930s are a big deal. A lot of people do important things during the 30s and then the 40s. We need to look at Claude Shannon, for example. Now, he's obviously the godfather of information theory. We'll get there, but his first massive contribution is his master thesis, where he shows that you cannot only use, binary numbers to do all kinds of stuff, but you can also use a binary system to model logic. In particularly the Boolean logic system, which means a or, an and a not function, right? You can use those. And that means suddenly you can actually replicate all possible forms of calculation and logic and so forth and operations on a system that uses, say, electrical current or anything of the sorts. That's where computing becomes really, really possible, and that's like the 1930s. Alan Turing is big on that as well, and writes an important paper there where he talks about, like, well, if we make machines that can do intellectual labor, maybe they will start thinking and they become like humans. So what can we do to make sure that, or figure out if a machine is as intelligent as a human? And he writes a paper and he calls it The Imitation Game. See what I did there with the title? Anyway, he does that, and it's the basic Turing tests. We have a machine and we have a human and we have a judge, and the judge communicates with both, and if it's unable to decide which of the two conversation partners is the machine, then the machine has reached human intelligence level. It's just something that Turing thought would work. It doesn't. We'll get there. Anyway, World War II starts, a lot of different technologies are used, and after that people start trying to figure out what just happened and how to combine these kind of things in research. This is the 1940s. A lot of stuff happens here. We'll have to look at Walter Pitts and Warren McCulloch, who start formulating a model of the human neuron, a mathematical one. We'll get back to them in the next section, but this happens in the early 1940s. Also, Claude Shannon writes more on the concept of information theory, how all information can in fact be notated in mathematical formula and calculated, and we can calculate the value of information. This is really important because it basically reduces information to a commodity, something that can be calculated just by mass and separated by mass and not by the actual sort of content. This is really important once again because that's what we need for what we do today. So people start working on all of these different concepts, and they decide that it's time to actually all hang out and have a conference on this and maybe figure out what to do. So John McCarthy actually is the guy who gets to do that job and organize a conference. And he's like, well, I guess I need to figure out a way to do that. I need money, I need funding. So what am I going to call this conference? It's supposed to happen in 1956 in Dartmouth College in Hanover, somewhere in the US, not in Germany. And what happens there is that he doesn't want to use the term cybernetics, which has been around since the 1930s, because it's a concept coined by Norbert Wiener. Norbert Wiener is a bit of a odd duck and not necessarily very beloved. The fact that computer science was called cybernetics in the GDR and other parts of the Soviet-aligned part of the world during the Cold War will tell you one thing here, and I'm bringing that up not just because, Norbert Wiener is weird, but because it shows that a lot of this development is colored by politics and is very much colored by, say, the United States, feeling that the United States is the hub of the world and so forth. See, that other 1776 coming back to haunt us here. So cybernetics is out, and instead it has to be something else. Now, McCarthy wants to call it automata studies, which is a really cool name, but doesn't really capture the imagination of people who have money. So after a while, he calls it artificial intelligence. And with that first conference on artificial intelligence, the term sticks. That's why it's a marketing term. It's made to get money out of a university administration. And it works. All of these people meet there. McCarthy is there. Claude Shannon is there. Marvin Minsky, who works at MIT and does a lot of robotics stuff and automation stuff. All of them are there, and they talk about these fields. There are mathematicians there, there's psychologists there, there's electronics people there, and that's where the field of artificial intelligence officially starts, so to speak. One thing that is important here is that big separation between symbolic or AI and connectivist AI. And most of the people from that 1956 workshop come down on the side of symbolic AI. That means something that works from coded facts and rules of thinking to get results. You get data in and then results out, but it works because it has a symbolic representation of the world. So you write down hard code, the facts of that world that you're trying to operate with. And that is a fairly restrictive way of doing it, but it's something that people have always done. It aligns with how we do mathematics and so forth, with like logical deductions. It's deductive logic. We'll get back to that later on when we talk about connectivism. However, in 1957, Frank Rosenblatt builds the perceptron, which doesn't work that way. It's a connectivist AI. We'll talk about that as I said, that's in the next section. And it's a big deal for a couple of weeks or months, and then Marvin Minsky and a colleague write a book that shows that perceptron isn't as powerful as everyone thought. And connectivist AI soon thereafter sort of vanishes for a long time. This is important because it shows a pattern in AI history. We talk about cycles here, and AI winters and AI springs. So an AI spring is usually when everyone believes that full-on intelligent machines are right around the corner, and they don't happen, and then no one wants to talk about artificial intelligence at all, and there's no funding and so forth, and that's an AI winter. And they come in periods. And so the shutting down of the perceptron is sort of when the first AI winter kind of comes. And it coincides with several things. Obviously, unfortunately, Frank Rosenblatt passes very, very young. Also, a really important bit happens, and that is Joseph Weizenbaum creates a chatbot, the first one. He calls it Eliza after the character in the musical My Fair Lady, and it's a chatbot that is basically on symbolic AI principles. It has a very few, very simple rules of how to communicate. Well, you do it by keyboard and screen, obviously, but you can say something and it will then reply to you by transposing elements of your from your answer or sentence and turn it into a question and so forth. It's patterned on talk therapy in a lot of ways, and it has very simple rules that anyone can understand because it's a very short program in that regard. And what Weizenbaum wants to show is that people are, or that's what he finds out basically, that is that people don't believe that it's a simple machine and start ascribing understanding and intelligence and personality to that chatbot, even though they know or get told that it is based on very few simplistic rules. This Eliza effect is coming back again and again and again, and will haunt us and does haunt us right now. It also shows that the whole Turing test from the Imitation Game kind of falls flat, because we are willing to ascribe intelligence and are maybe unable to differentiate between a machine and a human very soon, as soon as they start using natural language in one way or another. And Joseph Weizenbaum becomes a critic of artificial intelligence and the uses and the responsibilities of computer scientists. Really impressive man. He gave a talk at my university when I was still studying computer science, and really impressive person. And we should keep that Eliza effect in mind. So from then on, there is some research with with symbolic AI. Expert systems are built, and they are successful in a lot of ways, when they are in fact, limited to a very specific field that can be formalized quickly. This is the really important part. If you can take a problem, even an intellectual labor problem, and can combine it, boil it down into a few formal rules, then it's easy to write a software, a program that can in fact use that and create, an expert system. However, the more rules you have, the more variants, the more questions you need to answer in your software that all need to be, put into those rules, and the complexity soon overwhelms the capabilities of those writing the system. That's the limitation, the big limitation of symbolic AI in a lot of ways, is the combinatorial explosion as soon as problems become too complex to formalize easily. Language is one of those problems, obviously, because while we have grammar rules, we also have millions of, alternatives and so forth. This is important to keep in mind because that's the big limitation to symbolic AI. There's a limitation to connectivist AI that really sank the perceptron at the time, and that is the limitation to hardware, because for that one you need a lot of computing power that wasn't available back then. So the limitations are, on the one hand, the more complex something gets, the more difficult it gets to be reproduced with symbolic AI. And with connectivist AI, the smaller the amount of computing power and data is, the harder it gets to do something. So these two limitations will always play off each other. So yeah, that's where we are mostly all the way until the, mid-2000s, when the limitations that held back connectivist AI suddenly vanish. And that's what we need to talk about in the next section. So, if we can't automate thinking, why not build a brain and hope that it starts thinking all on its own? Part 2. I build the mind electric. Cheers. So this part will mostly cover connectionist models of artificial intelligence, large language models, the kind of stuff that everyone is talking about these days. And it is based on, once again, The Eye of the Master, A Social History of Artificial Intelligence by Matteo Pasquinelli, which focuses heavily on the history of connectionist models in a lot of ways. And it's, their connections to psychology and, once again, labor rights and the extraction of knowledge in a lot of ways. I, once again, highly recommend this book in that regard. It obviously also still focuses on Kate Crawford's Atlas of AI and Karen Howe's Empire of AI, which are both, mostly focused on the contemporary artificial intelligence industry and its costs in a lot of ways, with Karen Howe mostly heavily focusing on OpenAI as a company. It's also based on The Infinity Machine by Sebastian Mallaby, which is a history of Demis Hassabis and Google DeepMind, and now Google DeepMind. And while it is relatively good, it suffers from the problem that it is written by Sebastian Mallaby, who is a hagiographer of capitalism and incapable of not writing stories about great men of history, which obviously allows him a lot of access to people that other more critical authors don't get. So you get lots of interesting quotes by people like Demis Hassabis, but makes him incapable of mentioning systemic problems. As an example, it takes until the second to last chapter of that book for him to mention that maybe some of the training data was acquired without, taking into consideration copyright law. For a 500-page book, that's pretty bad, I would argue. So, unless you really want to know details about the Demis Hassabis and Google DeepMind, I think you get a better explanation of what is going on from Karen Howe's Empire of AI. It's obviously also based on, books and stuff I read during my computer science days, but I don't remember those sources specifically. Anyway, let's get started, once again, back in time, because we need to talk about something really important that we often underestimate. And that is how technology, science, and language interact. See, what we need to do science, what we need to come up with ideas is obviously concepts in our heads, and we take them from the existing world and try to apply them on new things out there and hope that they halfway fit, and then maybe we can progress. So usually what happens is that, we develop a new technology. That new technology allows us to develop new concepts, new scientific concepts, terms, ideas, metaphors, and so forth. Those then allow us to, build new machines, new technologies, and so forth. So it's an ever ongoing dialectic, one might almost say. The problem with this is, of course, that the concepts we apply to new technologies are still very much rooted in what we already have. So let's talk about that for a second before we move further on when we talk about artificial intelligence. See, we humans have always considered ourselves fairly smart, or to put it in a different way, we have always assumed that our form of being smart, what we call intelligence, vaguely, we'll get back to what that really means at some point, is what makes us human, and that it is the thing that makes us, or the thing we are best at on this planet, right? So what we have always used when trying to explain how technology, how intelligence works, how our minds work, has always been sort of like the most complicated, most complex, and most advanced technology that we have had at the times. So you get ideas of our minds are just clockwork, or our minds are connections, connecting, communicating tubes, hydraulics, whatever was the most most complex and advanced technology at the time, which means that later on, when we are entering the early 1900s in the 20th century, and people are starting to once again turn to, the brain, now with, new technology that allows us to, better microscopes and so forth that allow us to understand or at least see how brains are, consisting out of individual cells, neurons, and all of that kind of stuff, right? The next more complex technology that we find, or that we have at the time, is what is applied as our metaphor, as our concept, as our image of like how the brain functions. So we move away from clockwork and steam engines or whatever. We move away from that to the telegraph system, or the telephone system. Well, first telegraph and then telephone, but they're the same, because they are a distributed network of things, and we have figured out that our brain consists of lots of individual neurons that are connected into a large network. So that is the metaphor that is applied. However, that does inform how we then think about human intelligence and brains, and that is a bit of a problem that we'll come back to. But you already know that nowadays we consider, brains to work like computers in a lot of ways. And that is obviously because right now computers are, in one way or another, the most advanced technology that we have that does something that feels like it is, something that is akin to thinking, right? But once again, it is the limits of that technology that do limit our understanding of the thing that we are trying to describe with that, with those concepts. And it is important to keep that in mind when trying to, define intelligence of machines with, biological metaphors that have been developed from, other machines that we have at the time. So keep that in mind. And now let's look at history of this stuff before we get to, where we are right now. So one thing that happens in the early 20th century is the understanding of input and information processing in one way or another, and realizing that a lot of things, beings, animals, humans, whatever, are in fact, or can be defined as, entities that process input from the outside world, change themselves according to that input, and then produce an output, and so forth. So you have a feedback between the outside world and the inside world of, animals, humans, and possibly machines. That is where a lot of development goes into at the time, going, so what if we could build machines that can, change themselves and adapt themselves to external inputs, possibly even start to replicate bits and, rebuild themselves. That's a long process, and people have been involved in that for a long time. We have self-replicating machines, or we are dreaming of self-replicating machines and that kind of stuff. And a lot of this is developed during the 1920s and 1930s by people around Norbert Wiener, who comes up with a term for that. That term being, of course, cybernetics, which is derived from the Greek term kybernatos, I think, which is the steersman. Because obviously a steersman on a boat sees the outside world and moves the rudder and so forth. You get the feedback thing, right? So that's where cybernetics as a term comes from. And this is obviously highly interesting to people who are doing pure research in the 1920s, and then, of course, people who need that research for, building weapons. We have talked about this in the past, right? Funding for innovation can come from different groups, and what drives information can come from different interests. One of them is tinkering, building better machines to make more stuff. That is industry funding, capitalist funding. That is what drives, a lot of development around the steam engine and industrial capitalism, and the beginnings of, in that regard, artificial intelligence research. If we go back to people like Babbage, it's industrial interests. Then there is, of course, another form of funding and interest drive, and that is pure research, blue sky, just being curious about like how shit works. That is academia, and academic funding and academic interest is what drives a lot of this kind of research in the early 20th century, what with things like psychology starting to become a thing, biology and so forth, and all of these rekindle the interest in what makes stuff think and what makes people intelligent. There's a darker side to a lot of this, which is of course the research into are there differences in intelligence between people from different places with different skin colors. That's where a lot of eugenics comes in. That's where a lot of like skull measuring and shit comes in. A lot of the people who are doing this in academic contexts and are developing pioneering methods that we use until today. This is something I would call foreshadowing. We'll get back to that, is what I'm saying. So during that time, a lot of the stuff that turns into cybernetics is developed in the 1920s and so forth out of these academic interests. However, once World War II really becomes a thing, ideas of self-repairing or self-adapting machines are very, very, tantalizing and tempting to, say, the military. And a lot of more, military funding is poured into these research projects. This is important because this means a slight shift of, the drivers and the motives for innovation and the goals that are set for innovation and research, right? This will continue for a while longer, and we'll need to keep an eye on that. Because once research is done on computers, on actual computers, calculating machines, it requires access to these large computers. And early computers, built in the 1930s, 1940s, and so forth, they are usually property of universities mostly, and usually also at the same time funded by the military who needs those big machines. There is as yet no commercial application for large computers, so very little industry funding is coming into these topics and into these researchers. All right, now let's look at some of the interesting developments around all of that. So we already mentioned in the 1930s, Claude Shannon proves in his master's thesis that you can, recreate Boolean logic of and or not those Boolean operators for logic in binary code, and thus in electric logic gates, and actually create, the foundation for that type of computers. Because everything you can, in fact, represent as binary code can thus be manipulated by a computer that is built out of some form of electronic logic gates or electronic circuit. Now, these are at the time still built from tubes, vacuum tubes, and stuff like that. It will take a while until we settle on silicon semiconductors, but that's the first big step here, is that you can in fact use Boolean logic, and everything that can be expressed by Boolean logic can be expressed by a computer. That is really important. Now, the next thing is that slightly later, Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts are looking at some of this and realize that you could, in fact, represent a human, like a neuron in a brain, as such a logic gate, or as such a, such a logic gate. And they are deliberately taking inspiration from these types of, telegraph networks, or, of course, individual, logic gates that can do that kind of Boolean logic. And they come up with the first model for such a neuron, the first mathematical neuron for that, which is called the McCulloch-Pitts unit, and is basically still the basis for every single thing that is, comes with artificial neural networks. Basically what they say is, well, you have a neuron, it has individual inputs, signals are coming into that thing, and once enough signals are coming into a neuron, it will fire a signal to the next neuron, tie these together into a large network. That's how the brain works. But what is important is that this is not necessarily them understanding how actual human brains work, or animal brains work, but them using the metaphor and the understanding of things like the telegraph network and applying them, and logic gates, and applying them to taking that paradigm and applying it to the brain, and saying, well, now we can represent the brain as a computer. They also prove that you can, in theory, anything that can be represented as, a formal program, and that's as, in Boolean logic and binary code, can be calculated by a large enough network out of these McCulloch-Pitts units. That is really a big, big step forward. And the next big step forward comes once people figure out or start to formulate rules for how these networks can change and can actually adapt, because we have for a time now known that human brains can in fact adapt. If something gets damaged or whatever, brain structures will rewire. So how does that work? It's nowadays called neuroplasticity, and the first big rule there is comes from Donald Hebb, once again in the 1940s and 50s, and that is obviously that if two neurons are connected, and the first neuron fires a signal and the second neuron then also fires that signal, passes that signal on, then that connection will be strengthened. So the next time the first neuron will fire, the second one will also fire that pass on that signal. It's often summed up in neurons that fire together, wire together, and it strengthens that connection. That is how neuroplasticity sort of can be represented once again in mathematics. This is once again a key thing because it explains how learning could potentially work in such of these networks. Remember, the McCulloch-Pitts unit network does not have an understanding for that. It just means we have this large network, and if we wire those individual neurons together in the correct way, it will produce the correct result. But how the wiring changes over time, that is something new. That is how learning is defined, right? After a while. This is really important. Now we come to another person that you were probably not expecting to show up this early on. Friedrich Hayek. Piece of shit, to blame for a lot of things that are wrong with the world today. Also someone who did study as a while as a psychologist, and he has taken the idea of like how society works or how thinking works and applies that to how markets might work, because markets change over time. A lot of times markets are not necessarily used to the precise information and all of that. And to counteract the idea of central planning at the time, he comes up with a model of markets that is more like a distributed telegraph network, where some information ends up somewhere and some doesn't end up at the same place. This is really important because he says what thinking really means in most cases, and what markets also do, boils down to a yes or no decision. Taking the information that you have and deciding this is enough to put it to do something. That's classification. He comes up with that term, right? Or pattern recognition. Like we have a specific signal, we do that specific thing. At its core, we're sorting information or patterns of information into different buckets. And he writes a book about that. That is, once again, really important in this regard. And all of these different, disparate sort of elements come together when we create the first artificial neural network that can, in fact, sort of learn to classify. That is created by Frank Rosenblatt in 1957 or to the 1960s. It is called the perceptron. Now, Rosenblatt also studied psychology, and he realized something. We will go into mathematics for a second, and you'll have to bear with me there. But he basically takes all of these informations. He takes the McCulloch-Pitts units. He combines them with the idea of Hebb's learning algorithms, of changing the weights over time. If something has led it to a success, so to speak. He takes the Hebb rule for learning, and he takes the idea of reducing thinking, so to speak, into pattern recognition from Hayek, and he turns all of that into a network that does exactly that, the perceptron. The perceptron Mark I basically has an input. That input is a bunch of photocells that can recognize light and dark, 20 by 20, so 400 cells, and after using it's tied to a network of these basically McCulloch-Pitts units that can rewire or change sort of like the pattern between those individual nodes according after a while by training, and it can after a while sort cards that either have a dark blob on one side or on the other side into the correct bucket of basically one or the other. It later also can recognize simple letters if they are placed on the correct part of that 20 by 20 square, really. And it works. That is the first artificial neural network. Now let's look at mathematics for a second. I'm sorry, but we have to go through this. So, what the first part we need to understand is what basically happens with Hebb's rule, how that is built in. So you have your basic network, which consists of a bunch of McCulloch-Pitts units, basically, that are wired together. So you have a first layer that takes in the input that is directly wired, literally physically wired, to your photocells, your input. And it then, combines those and sends them to a second layer that is basically a computation layer, and then to a third layer that is basically an output. In the first one, it's just a light bulb that goes light on or light off, depending on whether the black mark is on the correct side of your card, right? Very simple in that regard. So how does the learning work? Well, basically, what we do in this situation is that because the units between one layer and the next layer are wired together, we can basically increase, or we add a weight to that connection. So we go, well, if this neuron fires, then this will be, the effect will be increased to the next layer, or will be decreased because it's clearly not that important for whatever task we're doing right now. And these weights can be adjusted over time. That's where you can build in the what fires together, wires together thing, right? Because obviously if those neurons fire together, then you increase the weight, and if they don't fire together, you decrease the weight. That's the basic understanding. The final part is, of course, you train this by doing this a lot of times, and you change the weights every time you get the wrong answer, right? You get the correct answer, right? You get the wrong answer, you change the weights, and you do this with enough cards until you always get the correct result, or almost always, depending on, how correct you want your information to be. So that is how the thing is built. All right, let's talk about how this works and what the underlying theory is, right? That's where we come back to our eugenics and psychologist statisticians, right? Rosenblatt worked as a psychologist, and what is big in the 1950s is the concept of psychometry. Now, psychometry is obviously you have personality quizzes, and you then sort people into groups of personality types, character types, whatever. It's the same thing that you use basically for, IQ tests, in that you, let people fill out a lot of questionnaires, and you then sort them into boxes according to number. That's where this sort of like technology comes from. And in the 1950s, people are really big on finding these personality types and sorting people according to that. Classifying them as you will, right? All right, so what happens is that Rosenblatt realizes that if you take a lot of these quizzes, which have, number values for each response, or a 1 or 0, depending on whatnot, you can represent them as, once again, a square. Like, you can represent these individual values the same way that you can represent something on that 20 by 20 matrix for your perceptron. Because you can turn all of these into vectors, into long vectors. That's where the mathematics stuff comes in, right? Your 20 by 20 has 400 individual photocells, right? They can be either light on or light off, 1 or 0, binary. Now you can write this as a 20 by 20 matrix, or you could write this as a one long 400 boxes long vector, parameters long vector, and then every possible combination of these points, every possible combinations of 1s and 0s in your input matrix is one such 400 parameters long vector. Yeah, those parameters are called dimensions, so you suddenly have a 400 dimensional vector space. And obviously all of these patterns can then be mapped onto a very small vector space that can, for, each of the possible answers, a 1 or a 0. Is it the correct pattern or is it not the correct pattern? That's the fundamental thing, and that is the same thing that you do with your psychometry. Each of your possible answer sets is then mapped to one of the possible personality groups. That's the fundamental understanding of how classification works and how you can represent these in artificial neural networks through training. You take all of your possible answers in one bucket and all of your possible inputs into the other bucket, and you find a way to map one to the other. You reduce them in dimension, basically. That's mathematics. And since you can do all of that in just, binary code, because you can represent everything in binary code in this regard, all you then need to do is, have enough input to set those weights correctly, and after that, it's just like letting all these inputs up through. And you do all of that just by multiplying ones and zeros, which is really simple computationally, in theory. It takes a while to actually catch up when it comes to hardware. Right. Now you know how all artificial neural networks work, basically. Obviously, the way of adapting those vectors, the weights between those neurons, all of that stuff is getting way more complicated nowadays, but that's the theory. All your ChatGPT does at the end of the day is multiply numbers, a lot of them. What you see, however, is that this gets really complicated and requires a lot of calculations. What it, however, does not require is a lot of individual, cases and stuff like that, because you only need your correct outputs and then you're basically done. Which solves the combinatorial problem that we had with our deductive AI that we talked about in the first chapter. We have changed a problem in defining stuff into a problem that's a hardware and data problem. And as we already mentioned, that's a big problem for this form of connectionist artificial intelligence, because, well, at the time they don't have enough data and they don't have enough calculating power. That's where people like Marvin Minsky and so forth come in, and that is why the first AI winter happens, and that's why this specific form of artificial intelligence, that is image recognition, pattern recognition, and classification, stays dormant for a long time. Now, one other thing that is important to understand here is, of course, that you can do two things with this specific form of architecture, right? You can give in an input and tell me and ask, is this a 1 or a 0? Is this a letter? And so forth. You can classify. But you could also obviously do this the other way around and go like, well, give me a possible, give me a prediction. Give me the next thing that also is very close to the thing that I already have and so forth. That is where you create generation, right? You generate an answer. That is where generative AI comes in, that we have nowadays as well, which is the one that most people use because, it's public facing and it creates fun pictures and shit like that, right? Okay, now let's move on. So this form of AI, it works, but it is highly intensive in calculation and in computation and hardware and data. However, so far it's mostly done for images. One more thing becomes interesting here. We come to the 1980s and the whole idea of writing down every explicit rule is coming to sort of like the limits of its capacity. And one person doing a lot of research in that regard is someone who's trying to do language recognition, speech recognition, and so forth for IBM. It's Robert Mercer, big Donald Trump donor, right-wing billionaire, German, the whole 9 yards. Really terrible person. And he works on that. And what he does is try once again sort of statistics and use lots of language data and hope that the underlying structures, the underlying rules of how languages work are embedded in those texts. Now, this is really helpful because language is fairly structured and thus the data is fairly structured. So there's a good chance that if with enough data, you can actually do this. And he proves that works, and it's part of what makes him rich before he gets into, venture capital and all kinds of other shenanigans. And that is sort of where we see the first glimmerings of artificial neural networks becoming a bigger deal once again, because technology moved on. Let's talk about rules for a second, and then we'll get into where we are now. Moore's Law. You've heard about it. It is wrong, but it worked for a while, so everyone believed it. See, Gordon Moore, president or CEO of Intel, before then Fairchild Semiconductors and so forth, big guy when it comes to computer chips, realized that those chips were getting better and better and better relatively steadily. Like, the number of circuits they could put on 1 square inch of the silicon were getting, more and more. And he looked at this and he made a curve and said, oh, this is exponential. It doubles every 18 months or so. So that's what he made a prediction and called it, well, someone called it Moore's Law. Computing power will double every 18 months. It got adjusted a bunch of times. But that is an underlying law, and it held more or less into the early to mid 2000s before we realized that it doesn't work that well anymore. We will talk about those kinds of laws later, all right? But it means that computing power, the thing that Rosenblatt struggled with in the 1950s and 60s, is getting less and less and less of a problem. Also, computers are becoming a thing interesting for, say, companies. We just mentioned that Mercer worked for IBM, and that means, of course, they create a lot of data once again, right? Because people are working on these things. Other people are logging the stuff that they are working on these things and writing this stuff down to, control their workers, their laborers, and all of that kind of stuff. So more and more data is created and available. And with the beginning of the 1990s, the internet is finally getting sort of like a thing. So more and more data is available, which are the two things that held back connectionist artificial intelligence and these artificial neural networks in the 1950s and 60s. Because remember, you need a lot of data to train the thing, and you need a lot of, computing power to actually run that training and then run the network, because, you need to do a lot of calculations. And that is why and how artificial neural networks are becoming more popular. There are a bunch of, changes and further developments in the 1980s and then during the 1990s and during the 2000s. Most of that stuff is still happening at universities because, there's not that much funding right now. No one has found a really good sort of like use case, what to do with these artificial neural networks and so forth. But because these are geeks who like to, work around this stuff, they start comparing their research. And they do this by having a competition. This is where ImageNet comes in. We're still doing image recognition here, and ImageNet is one set of lots of images that have been labeled, and every year all the people who are working in this field bring their best artificial neural network or other AI system, and they compare them and see how many of the images they get correct. And then the winner gets a pat on the back and presumably hammered at the artificial intelligence conference afterwards. Something happens, and that is Geoffrey Hinton, who now has a Nobel Prize and is a bit insane and all of those things, and his team believe that if you add more and more computing layers between your input and your output of your artificial neural network, if you basically make the thing much bigger, that does make it much better. That's what he calls deep learning, and there's a bunch of algorithms that make that thing work. And he believes in that. And his team, that includes a couple of other people, creates one such network. They call it AlexNet, after the chief PhD student working for him in that regard. Another one that is working for him in that team and is another driving force is, of course, Ilya Sutskever. Remember that name? And they smash, by magnitudes, the ImageNet competition in 2012. So suddenly everyone realizes this stuff might actually be, workable now. We may actually be able to do this. And obviously they spin out that thing into a company. Google buys them for way too much money. And we're off to the races with artificial intelligence in the 2010s. And this doesn't stop until now. It still hasn't. The important thing is that with buying Hinton's company and then buying another artificial intelligence company, that being DeepMind, after they created a neural network based software that beats people at say Go. It's AlphaGo. They acquire DeepMind, run by Demis Hassabis. So Google is heavily investing in this. This means that research has shifted, and funding and innovation has shifted once again from the academic field, sometimes with military stuff in it, sometimes not, into the industry side of things. It is now funded by corporations, by businesses who have very different incentives and interests when it comes to what to build and how to build it. And they compete against each other, which means we're, in the year 2015, And when Sam Altman, who has been in venture capital funding and stuff like that, talks to Elon Musk and goes like, hey, maybe Google shouldn't be the only company doing AI because they might get it wrong, because, they might create an evil Uber machine that will actually destroy everything. They might create Skynet, and we don't want that. Maybe we should also build one of these companies, but make it good by, creating artificial intelligence for the benefit of mankind. And Elon Musk is immediately in because he has already some beef with Larry Page and doesn't like Demis Hassabis and so forth. And they start a company called OpenAI, by which I mean they start a non-profit called OpenAI that has the goal to create artificial intelligence for the benefit of all mankind. And they start immediately buying up all the AI talent that is not yet working for Google. They are hiring them away from universities to also integrate them into, a free market, corporate run, venture capital funded competition. And they even hire Ilya Sutskever, who has, went with Geoff Hinton to Google. They hire him for insane amounts of money. We're talking millions here, which is, that's where the whole competition starts to really blow up. And OpenAI, fucks around a lot. And after a while, they create a large language model, by which, we have an artificial neural network that is mostly trained on language at this point because, there's a lot of text on the internet, so this is really easy. And it can both create text and, it can create text according to prompts given. And GPT-1 is impressive, but it's, nothing big. They do that. And GPT means General Pre-trained Transformer. Transformer is one thing that makes these networks, large language models, better at, having a larger context and thus being able to create longer text that, feels reasonable and so forth. It's general because it, is trained on like a lot of stuff. And it's pre-trained because it is, you have this large model that you train on all of this data and then you fine-tune it onto something that is actually supposed to do, like, English language, for example. That's what GPT means. They build this, and it's good, and it shocks everyone how good it is, and then they improve it, and they build it and call it GPT-2, and then they call it GPT-3. And that's where stuff will get interesting again. However, because all of this needs a lot of data, which is mostly stolen, we'll get to that, don't worry. Because it needs a lot of calculations, it becomes very clear that running this as a non-profit isn't really that easy. Obviously, all the other big tech corporations are investing heavily to also do this kind of stuff. So they need to maybe find a way to get venture capital funding because, venture capitalists are not funding non-profits. They want profit after all. And that leads to a conflict between Sam Altman and Elon Musk, which Elon Musk loses. He leaves. He starts his own AI company, which he, has folded into XAI and has now, is Grok at this point. And Sam Altman keeps running the company by creating a weird hybrid thing between a non-profit and a for-profit part, which will lead to conflicts down the road. However, what is also important is that people are getting more and more worried about this technology because it makes really big leaps at the time. And OpenAI discovered something they call scaling laws, which is similar to Moore's law, and it is inspired by Moore's law, which means that the larger we make this model, the more text we pour into it, the more calculations we add, the larger we make, the longer we train it, the more artificial neurons like we use for this, right? The better it will get. And we can also plot this on a curve, and it's also going to be exponential. And they come up with this, and it works for, GPT-2 and GPT-3. And possibly even GPT-4. So they're like, wow, this is going to be insane. It talks to us in human language. Remember the Eliza effect. People start thinking this stuff is sentient just because it uses, human-sounding language. And it gets better and better and better. So people are getting scared and wondering if this will take over the world. You remember we talked about this in the past. And, some people are getting more worried about this than others. The people who are getting more worried about this are Dario Amodei and friends around him who are really worried about artificial intelligence safety, which was supposed to be, the thing that OpenAI did and Google didn't because Google was evil, right? And those people decide to leave. So in 2015, OpenAI is founded. In 2018, Elon Musk leaves. In 2021, Dario Amodei, his sister, and a couple of other people who are supposedly more worried about about artificial intelligence about the security leave. They form their own company. It's called Anthropic. And then the competition is really off the races. Like, obviously, Meta has also started their own thing, Facebook, so everyone is doing this. Microsoft has invested in the now for-profit part of OpenAI, so everyone is pouring insane amounts of money in this, is moving ever faster because they believe it's a zero-sum game, and whoever builds the biggest, takes the whole market will actually win, and everyone else will lose. Which brings us to 2022, where something key happens. And that is, Sam Altman is worried that Anthropic has come up with an idea, that is adding a chatbot to their large language model. See, until then, you needed to do a lot of heavy coding and know a lot of stuff about this technology to get outputs. You couldn't just go, hey, machine, do. You needed to actually use programming languages and stuff like that. A chatbot would, however, change that. Like, you take a chatbot, it takes your input, maps that on the kind of code you need to actually then produce output, and then you hand that off to the next large language model, which will then produce the output that you wanted. So what happens is that Altman and friends decide to build such a chatbot themselves and have it on market before Anthropic. Obviously, because there's personal animus between those people, but also competition and all that. And they do that. They call it ChatGPT. They push it out with very little safety concerns and so forth to be first on the market. And ChatGPT becomes the biggest thing because everyone now on the internet can talk to a machine and will get answers that sound very human. So we have just taken ELIZA, the research project from Joseph Weizenbaum, have made it more powerful, have made it much better, and we've given it to everyone on the internet, and people lose their shit because this is 2022. We are still somewhere in the pandemic. Everyone is at home, has nothing to do, and this blows up. And that is where OpenAI sort of becomes, or ChatGPT for a while becomes synonymous with artificial intelligence, and everyone kind of loses their shit. And from then on out, stuff is slowly getting worse, by which I mean ChatGPT 4 will still be better, and that is, the model that then basically runs for a while. Everyone else is trying to build better models around that. Google releases Gemini, Anthropic releases Claude, and to make these models ever better, because everyone is still believing that Moore's law works, and everyone is still believing that the scaling laws work, people are trying to get more and more data and build bigger and better models, and that means they need to find more data wherever. They might not be concerned about the quality of that data as much, and they need to build more and more bigger data centers to run all of these computers that build those models, all in the hope that they will at last be the one last model standing and run either, God, or at least have all of the market. Which one of those? Who knows? But that's where we are right now. Now the question is, of course, after all of this, what can these models actually do? What can't they do? And at what cost? And that's what we'll have to talk about in the next part. If you've made it this far, you're probably asking yourself the same question that we are going to ask about artificial intelligence technology, and that is, was it all worth it? So let's talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, and the cost of it all. Cheers. So this is going to be a longer chapter where we will talk about the capabilities of large language models in particular, and the cost of their production. And we are basing this on a number of different sources. Two key sources are once again Empire of AI by Karen Howe and Atlas of AI by Kat Crawford, which cover a lot of the costs, both human and environmental costs of these models and, their capabilities. A third, source in this regard is The Infinity Machine by Sebastian Mallaby, which focuses more on Google's DeepMind versus, OpenAI and partly Anthropic, as does, Karen Howe's book. Anyway, these are some of the texts. Then we will be talking about a lot of, data quality and so forth, which we will, is based a lot on Safiya Noble's Algorithms of Oppression and Cathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction, and somewhat on Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. We'll also talk about, some of the economics behind this. Partly this will be based on Benjamin Shostakovsky's Behind the Startup, and of course on Cory Doctorow's new book, The Reverse Centaur's Guide to Life After AI. So this is most of the sources for this specific part. And before we move on, I think it's important to make several sort of things clear here, and that is, we are talking about products. We're talking about software products and not about anything else. Yes, a lot of people talk about intelligence, superintelligence, artificial general intelligence, and all of those things, but those are very vague terms. The definitions shift a lot, and we'll come back to them later, but for now we need to talk about software products. The reason we need to talk about software products is, of course, that there is a fundamental difference between academic research and, corporate research. See, when Geoff Hinton and Ilya Sutskever and and their colleagues won ImageNet with their new deep learning model, they were working at a university. That was something else. They did not have to make a functioning product, or at least, a product that does in fact make money. They just wanted to find something out and prove something, that they could build a specific software that could fulfill a specific task. That's all they wanted to do. The financial considerations were just not there. Now, when they thought they had an actual product, they did spin out a company, which was then, bought by Google and so forth, and here we are. However, when we're talking about GPT, which is, the product produced by OpenAI, or when we're talking about whatever, your Fable, Mythos, Claude, and so forth, the products created by Anthropic, these are corporations, either, have turned from non-profit to for-profit, or have, started as for-profit corporations, which means at some point they need to sell something and make more money selling whatever they are doing, their product, than they are spending on creating that product and, running that service, so to speak, right? They need to have a viable product. I'm bringing this up because this is one of the questions we need to answer here. Is this worth it? Is the technology actually making money? And the second reason I'm bringing this up is that when we talk about artificial intelligence right now, there are sort of several discourses happening at once. One is about AI taking jobs. One is about, AI as software in that regard, as a product, which mostly comes up with, computer programmers and stuff like that at the moment, but that is one part of it. A lot of other people, when we're talking about AI, think of using chatbots, either to just have conversations about whatever, or talking about, creating images for fun, and, mostly for fun at this moment, using Midjourney, using ChatGPT and so forth. That is what you might call consumer use or casual use. The question is that, a product that is worth money as well? And then there's, of course, other parts that large language models can fulfill that are outside of these enterprise uses, like coding harnesses to create software, that are more in the military and state surveillance area, because those, while being contracts that people are paying for, don't necessarily have the same sort of economics as something that you try to sell to other businesses, because states could theoretically print as much money as they want to create whatever, to buy your services. That's a third sort of area, and that's what we need to talk about here. Are there products there that are worth money on the open market? Are there products there that are worth something, that work financially on, the consumer market? Or is it all just stuff that we can sell to nation states so they can commit war crimes without further, human responsibility? We'll see where that goes. So that's the first thing that we need to talk about. Then there is another sort of definition that I wanted to bring up before we move further, and that is pre-training and post-training. See, what we do when we create such a large language model is, of course, we take a ton of data and pour it into that artificial neural network architecture to adjust the weights until we have reached a point where we assume that these weights are stable and we get the kind of output that we want to get. That is pre-training. Afterwards, we want to, adjust things, make sure that certain outputs, even though they are, technically part of the correct outputs, are not going to be done because we want to sell this to people outside. So, for example, we don't want our artificial neural network, our chatbot, our software tool to produce, illegal stuff like, say, child sexual abuse material or, correct instructions on how to build weapons, that kind of stuff, right? Like, we don't want that. There might be other things that we also don't want in that regard, and that is something that you do after you have created the actual model. The way you do that is usually through reinforcement learning, through human feedback, which means that you create these outputs, and every time an output comes out from your software that is technically correct, but not the thing that you want to actually have in a functioning product, you give human feedback in this regard and adjust the weights individually to make sure that these specific things will not be created as outputs in a consumer-facing software. That is post-training, and it's really important to do that if you want to have a functioning tool afterwards. We'll get back to the costs of that later on, but that's important to understand. And a final sort of pair of definitions is what you might call a frontier model versus a more specialized, smaller model. See, when we talk about our AI casually, people are usually talking about, GPT from OpenAI, although most people will just automatically say Chat GPT, even though that is just the chatbot part of it. Or people talk about Claude, or talk about Fable or Mythos and so forth. These are frontier models. What that means is that they are incredibly large. They use an insane amount of computing power and an insane amount of data of all kinds of all kinds of data types. They use text, they use video, they use audio, they use all kinds of biometric data, whatever these companies can get their hands on and feed into their model. That is important to understand because that leads to a very specific type of model that could potentially do all of these things, like create new video, create new audio, create new text, and so forth, but is, not specialized, and those are very, very large. On the other hand, you can have smaller models that are only trained on specific data to do a specific thing. Say, if you want to, analyze medical images to detect potential cancer or something like that, well, you probably don't need to train that on all the outputs of 4chan. You can just train it on a ton of medical imagery, because that's the stuff that you need, which means you need far less computing power and you need far less data and so forth. Those are specialized models, and they have been around for a long time. The big thing right now, and the thing that is driving this bubble, is the frontier models that are multimodal, that can do potentially everything and need an insane amount of, everything. And the question is, are these worthwhile? Because there are obviously, practical uses for these specialized models. So let's talk about what any of these, no matter the size, what any of these artificial neural networks can do and what they can't do. All right. They can do two things, right? We've already talked about it. Basically, what such a model does is it projects between a very high-dimensional vector space into a lower vector space, lower-dimensional vector space. That's all it does. And you can use that to do classification. That's the one first big thing, which is, image recognition, speech recognition, and so forth, where you take potential inputs and classify them by putting them into specific classes, boxes, like, is this a human face, is this not a human face? That's like two classes. You can do that. And it turns out for a lot of, types of data, classification through artificial neural networks works really well. If you can, in fact, find or get these classes of images just out of the raw data that are just in that one level of data, which is pixels, for example, when we're talking about images. If there is something beyond that, that goes beyond that mere first structure in the raw data that is just in there, then classification will not necessarily work. But classification is a useful tool. I already talked about the idea of, detecting potential cancer and stuff like that in medical data. It's really good for that. It can also be used to sort and cluster, say, archaeological data into different types and and so forth. Whenever you have data that has a lot of individual data points, in like for a lot of dimensions, blood tests, for example, you can check one drop of blood for so many different elements in it, right? Like that stuff is really easy, works really well when it comes to just like sorting it, like clustering it into different clusters and classifying it. And that is a tool that artificial neural networks can provide. There are obviously snags there, but it's, a good thing. Let's talk about the generation part next. Because what these models also can do is, of course, guess or take the stochastically next or closest point in that higher vector space to the input data, right? So you can just guess, or well, guessing is probably the wrong word, but like you can look at the most likely next thing. That is beyond guessing because it is, stochastics, statistics, really. So you can do that. And there are situations where that works really well. That is, say spell checkers, the kind of thing that tells you, hey, this looks very close to another word that might be the one that you need, that kind of stuff. It works really well for that. The thing here is that because it is just statistics, any deeper sense, if whatever data you are using has underlying structures that go beyond the stuff that is automatically encoded in just the raw data, this will fail. This is, when people talk about these just being word guessing programs, there's a lot of stuff, turns out, where guessing is good enough because we have a lot of, even with language, we have a lot of stuff that is fairly formalized in a lot of ways. There are parts where it is very clearly formalized. Software, coding is one of them, which is why computer programming is one of the parts where artificial intelligence is currently used a lot. That is, as I said, one part that works wonderfully, because computer programs are structured. If you train your artificial neural network on a lot of data or on a lot of code in one specific computer programming language, it will work really good, comparatively good, because software is highly structured. When it comes to writing fiction, it's less clear because there is a level of human intentionality that makes a writer decide what to do next, where to push this. That's the originality, that's the human element in there, and you can't have that by merely picking the next most likely thing that will happen and so forth. It does reproduce, once again, it reproduces structures that are within the data, but that's different from actual creation. So that's the limits of these tools. That's all they can do in any type of, in any mode. That's all there is to it. So is that useful? Sometimes. Is it worth burning the entire planet? Probably not. But let's look at the next part here, and I think it's important to understand this. Let's talk about data and structures that are implied in data. As I already said, these models need a lot of data to be trained with. The larger the model, the more data you need. And there are, for the first couple of years doing this, these companies discovered that the more data you put in and the larger you make your network, the better the output will be. This is intuitive, but the question is always, how much more data do you need to make it significantly better? And we'll talk about those laws later on. However, the question is, where do you get that data and what about that data? So here's the thing, in computer science, for a long time, there has been that thing where people call garbage in, garbage out. It's very simple. If the data you use for some program, for whatever, if that data is bad, then your results will also be bad, no matter how good the actual sort of like operations you use on that data are, because, the input is already shit. So that applies to these software tools, which is where the difference between frontier models and specialized models comes in to hit really hard. See, for the first couple of iterations of GPT and so forth, people did scrape data, and they took like large amounts of data, but they paid attention to what type of data that is. For example, for language, they scraped Wikipedia, because Wikipedia has usually these grammatically solid text, and is, and so forth. There's a relatively high standard because of the editing process in Wikipedia. So they took that. But what do you do if you need more data? I mean, you can take a lot of like written books. You can go to some antiquarian and buy them. You could potentially, buy a ton of ebooks. You could subscribe to Kindle Unlimited. All of those things are options. You can obviously also go to, say, Library Genesis, and download the entire collection of pirated ebooks from that one. The point is, while doing that is probably wrong and illegal, you are still getting pretty high quality data because all of these books have gone through some editing processes and so forth, and there is some level of quality control there. What do you do if you need more data than that, though? Well, I mean, you can go and scrape other parts of the internet to get all of that data. So you can, take everything from Reddit, and Reddit has less quality control. Let's put it that way, shall we, right? Once you feed all of the now closed subreddit r/the Donald into your large language model, it may pick up on some interesting things there. And what do you do if you need even more data? Well, you can take everything from 4chan and 8chan and 8kun, and all of the stuff on there has even less quality control and so forth. So the larger these models are, the worse the quality control on the software is, on the model is, and thus on the data is, of course, and the worse the results will be, because they will, as we just talked about, reflect the structures and the biases of the input data. That's the next important thing here. See, data isn't neutral. It's reproduces in one way or another. It reflects all the biases, the systemic issues of the place where you take your data from. That means, if you take everything from 4chan and 8chan and 8kun, you'll get a lot of racism, sexism, and so forth in there, because that's just how people talk on those platforms. And you get a lot of conspiracy theories, conspiracy narratives, and all of those. And these are somewhat structured. They follow specific patterns. All of that stuff will be encoded in your large language model. For example, and if you use software like that to do specific things, all of these prior biases will come in. Good example is artificial intelligence tools that predict the likelihood of a person reoffending when you ask the question of whether they could get out on bail or not, whether they that will guess the likelihood of someone being violent and so forth. When it comes to setting sentences and so forth. These tools exist. Now, I don't need to tell you that if you take as data for that, prior arrest records and prison sentence records and all of that data, you will, automatically represent and perpetuate all the potentially racist elements of the criminal justice system of whatever place you took that data from. And that's exactly what we can observe when it comes to these systems. They reproduce that. These systems automatically are racist because they are fed on data that is produced by, collecting racist actions of the last 50, 60, 70 years. And that is a problem, right? It's important to understand that that is a problem. The same goes for all kinds of other stuff, like sexism and so forth, because that's just like a thing that happens. If you train your artificial intelligence model on all the video that you can scrape from the internet, and you scrape all the pornography that you can get, it will reproduce a lot of very racist elements and misogynistic elements from publicly available pornography. That stuff will just automatically be in there. So the amount of data is already a problem. Then there's the question of what types of data will you get in there, and do the people that you take that data from, are they okay with that? The answer is, of course, yes and no. Obviously, illegally downloading ebooks from Library Genesis, not a good look. People have not consented to that, and so forth. That's bad. That's why both Anthropic and Meta have had to settle lawsuits afterwards, because they did that, and we know they did that. What about other data? Well, see, there's a lot of data that we just leave out there because we are using the internet, we are using the mobile internet, we are using all of these tools, and they create data. They create data residue. Whenever you click on something, that gets logged somewhere because Partly it needs to be done, and partly, the advertisement industry has convinced, other companies that with more data they can actually make advertisement work better and sell more stuff. There are questions whether that is true, but we don't need to know whether it's true or not as long as people who are buying ads believe it, which means that all kinds of internet services collect as much data as possible, and a lot of times we are not aware what kind of data they are all collecting. What about, say, license plate cameras, flock cameras that are all over, say the US? All of that data goes somewhere. Will that be used to train an artificial intelligence? Well, obviously it will. If they can sell that data to an AI company to train models on that, then yes, of course they will. Same goes with all your newfangled cars. One of the things that car companies have long done is, collect a lot of user data, performance data of cars, driving habits of, and so forth. All of that stuff is collected, also used to train artificial intelligence large language models. Does it actually improve these models' performances in any way, shape, or form? We don't know. Probably not. At least not in any way that we can clearly identify right now. But it is done, and it does constantly, if not violate any explicit law, it certainly is very invasive. And it means that every time you use anything on the internet, you are helping to train these large language models for some reason. Okay, so let's talk about the next part here, which is, of course, so you put all that garbage data into your large language models, and they create a lot of garbage. How do you go through that and to make sure that the products are not as garbage as they might be? The answer is, of course, you pay humans. Let's talk about ghost work for a second. There's a book with that title by Mary L. Gray and Siddharth Suri, but the concept is also explored in other texts. We all know this by now. There is a thing which means we pay people minimal amounts of money to, label images, to label outputs, to create proper inputs, and in some cases just take over for a large language model whenever the chatbot runs into any problem. The way you do that is, of course, you find people who will work for very, very little pay, whether that is on Amazon's Mechanical Turk or mTurk, or whether it is on any other platform that offers click work. Usually what the kind of people you find for that are desperate people in the global south. And you can dump the prices down as low as possible, which is exactly what these people do. This is, once again, the exploitation model of artificial intelligence, because what you do when you force people to, label CSAM for, fractions of cents per image all day long, is you are expropriating their understanding, their knowledge of what is considered to be that material or not. You remember that famous phrase about pornography? It's like, it's hard to define, but I know it when I see it. Yeah, that is a specific type of knowledge, knowing when you see it. And that knowledge gets expropriated for incredibly microscopic money. And at a lot of cost, because it turns out that, looking at the most vile material that can be produced at any point in time, well, if you do that all day long, it leaves marks. It leads to all kinds of mental health struggles, to mental damage, to trauma, to put it mildly. But if you do this in, say, Kenya or Venezuela or even, refugee camps outside of, civil wars and so forth, people are desperate enough, you can't just force all that additional trauma on them and not provide anything beyond that. And we know that a lot of the companies that provide that human feedback for that reinforcement learning in post-training have engaged in exactly that type of behavior. They have expropriated the knowledge and, very much exploited all of these employees. So every model you are using right now is built on the trauma of thousands of people in the global south, just simply by virtue of them having to see the most horrible and vile stuff. And to just drive home how insane this is, how do you get those models to produce those vile images that you want to have, taken out of the product? Well, you have someone who prompts those models to create that artwork, to create those images, to create those texts, to do all of that stuff. And those are usually highly paid employees in the global north, in the imperial core, as you will, that sit there and prompt these large language models to produce the most vile shit that they then send to people in the global south to suffer from. Pretty good, right? No, it sucks. All right, so that's one important part about the human cost of creating these models. Now let's talk about the other costs. See, we already talked about the fact that these models are large, at least the really big frontier models, which means they need a lot of computer chips, usually mostly highly parallel graphics processing units, GPUs, which are mostly produced by one company, which is NVIDIA, because NVIDIA has a specific architecture that is CUDA. It's a software architecture that allows you to run these multiplications in parallel, massively parallel. Anyway, so you need a lot of these computers. Now, what does running these computers entail? Well, you need electricity, which has to come from somewhere. You need, well, silicon, which has to come from somewhere. You need copper, which comes from somewhere, and so forth. All of this stuff adds up. Because it turns out that digging up copper and producing copper is a really invasive thing. It does, in fact, has come with a really high environmental cost. Now, obviously, people don't want to have a copper mine right behind their home because, it's ugly and it ruins the water and so much more. It doesn't stop, the current Trump administration from, basically opening up some protected parts of nature to copper mining right now, but usually you find places, once again, somewhere in the global south where people are desperate enough, or and their governments are dominated enough by the US and other parts of the imperial core that you can in fact ignore environmental protection laws and all of this kind of stuff to get the copper out of the ground. You can, or get all that sand that you need for, the silicon. Sand is a really, really important resource, and we often forget that we need it for so many things, and there are situations where sand is stolen in large quantities from, once again, protected nature and so forth, because, economics and stuff. So there is that. And then you put all of this stuff into put it into chips, and you put them into data centers. These data centers need power, they need space, and they need water, because you need to cool these things. You need potable water for that, and you need a lot of electricity. Where do you get electricity from? Well, from gas power plants, from nuclear power plants, potentially from, water, solar power, and so forth, but mostly from, once again, fossil fuels in one way or another. Biggest example here is, of course, Elon Musk's data center in Memphis, which runs on portable gas turbines, because he can circumvent environmental laws, and, he poisons a mostly black neighborhood with all of those, to put it mildly. So there's an insane environmental cost in all kinds of ways. The water situation, once again, is difficult to talk about. Yes, they need a lot of water. A lot of that water can be recycled, but once again, you build these data centers in places that are already sort of struggling. They're built currently, when we're talking about the US, in Arizona. Now, I don't know about you, but Phoenix, Arizona is not in fact built on a swamp, is it? You can read the excellent book, The Water Knife, by Paolo Bacigalupi, if you want to have a fun eco-thriller about that. Or you can read Cadillac Desert by Mark Reisner if you want to learn more about it in general, on like a history level. Or the same goes for data centers in Abilene, in Texas. Like, Texas is not exactly a swamp place, is it? So once again, it doesn't really matter how much water they are actually wasting if you build them in places that are already struggling to with a lack of water. So these costs. So what do you do when people in the global north protest against all of that? Well, once again, you go into the global south. You put it in places where governments have either less power and definitely, or have less protection, and people are desperate enough to let you build those things there, which is why you have data centers in, Argentina, in Colombia, in, apparently the Gulf region, which is really good if you want to, let your data center be hit by, say, Iranian drones, but, So there is an insane environmental cost to all of this. Now let's talk about the money part, and then we're hopefully done. See, you need to pay for electricity, you need to pay for water, you need to pay for all these chips, you need to pay for the construction of all of that stuff. Sometimes you may even have to pay for water, for data, sometimes, So building ever larger data centers to run ever larger models, to train these models, and to then run what is called inference, which is, people actually interacting with these models to get something out of them, right? All of this stuff costs a lot of money. because, that's none of this is really cheap. So there is an insane amount of capital expenditure right now with building more data centers and more data centers and more data centers, and running all of that stuff really expensive. So the question is, does that actually go anywhere? Is it worth it? Because right now, what we know is that these models cost more than they actually make, even though people, some people pay for these products. So let's talk about these products, why people might want some of them, and how much they might be willing to pay for that stuff, and then we're hopefully done. Let's talk about the first part here, which is, of course, chatbots. You are maybe using ones from time to time. It can help you. It makes maybe... because you're using, human natural language conversations, it can make stuff a bit easier, a bit more comfortable, and so forth. But how much are individual consumers willing to pay for, say, ChatGPT to just have conversations with it, bounce ideas off it, all of that kind of stuff? Are people willing to pay a lot of money for that? Probably not. However, there are dangers here. There's damage that is done here because with the ELIZA effect, people are trusting these machines and are assuming these machines, these software tools, in fact, could be conscious, and they start falling for this idea and interacting with them as if with humans. And if you assume that, all that bad data is in there and so forth, that's where you get to, the idea of AI psychosis, or whatever you want to call it, when people become addicted to using these tools and are led down some very, very dark paths. Because here's the thing, if you are paying for this, and if you are at some point in the future paying by either, seeing lots of advertisements, or by paying per hour, per token, which is, per input and so forth, there is an interest in having people use this tool for as much as possible. So you want to make it as, say, sycophantic as possible, because we know that if your computer is nice to you, you will probably use it more. So that is one big danger that is built into the need of these companies, of OpenAI and Anthropic and so forth, to make their product, work well. They haven't reached the point where it is, actually making money, but at least the use is up, which is possibly a good thing. Well, it's not, but right now that is one part where danger is once again baked in. Let's talk about the next part. Let's talk about enterprise use. Yes, artificial intelligence tools, large language models can help with coding. They can create a lot of code. The problems here are tied to the question of who does this and in what way. If you, as a coder, can decide when to, use a specific tool to create, say, boilerplate code that is really annoying to write and so forth, and the tool will probably produce something that is good enough, then these tools can be helpful. The point is, you as the individual producer, programmer, need to decide. You need to be a centaur, not a reverse centaur. On the other hand, if your boss tells you to use as much AI as possible, it gets more frustrating, because here's the thing. You still need to be a good programmer if you are using it in an enterprise situation for, say, creating code, because you need to go through that stuff afterwards, make sure that it does work, make sure that it doesn't make any mistakes, and so forth. Also, how do you actually judge any of the quality of that? Because programming code is not necessarily better the more lines of code there are, but more, how well it functions, how efficient it is, how safe it is, how secure it is. All of these things are not necessarily something you can measure with these AI coding tools, because they are a really interesting mashup of two things. They have a large language model underneath that produces the code, but they also, to make that code more viable, have a lot of very much hard-coded symbolic AI. The stuff from the first chapter that we talked about in there, that is mostly if and else and conditions and going like, well, do it this way, do it that way, and so forth, that have been added onto that. So there is some use there with coding tools, but it's very hard to measure, and it is, once again, very, very, compute intensive. And right now, as it is, the way these were paid, people pay for these, they are not actually making money. They are losing money on the side of OpenAI, Anthropic, and so forth, because people are not necessarily willing to pay the sheer amount of energy costs, water costs, and so forth that you need to keep the software running, these large models running. Obviously, this is different for, once again, smaller models that run on your own computer and so forth. That is a different thing. So that's the part that we have for the enterprise. It's not necessarily working. Let's talk about the final part, which is the state. We know that searching through large amounts of data to organize large amount of data and so forth is something that, large organizations need to do. Large companies need to do that. States need to do that a lot. And that's why a lot of states are very happy to make deals with individual corporations that provide these artificial neural network services to classify data. They are using it for all kinds of things. Sorting through data to find something. Selecting potential targets for attacks in Iran, for bombing, right? You can use it for that. You can use it to search through insane amounts of license plates that you've scanned somewhere to find patterns in that kind of stuff. States have a lot of interest in this. So the question is, and states can pay whatever a company asks for that, which is, why Anthropic and OpenAI and XAI Grok and, of course, Palantir are all trying to get more and more defense contracts and state contracts, because those are stable and they might be the only way to make this stuff profitable for companies. So what's the state getting out of that? Because we still have all these problems, right? Obviously, your AI might just select a girls' school to bomb instead of, a weapons factory or whatever. It may just, create lots of harm on the ground. And that, I think, is part of the deal that makes these tools so attractive to states. Because here's the thing, these are supposedly black boxes, because, we don't exactly know how they select the next thing, due to the amount of data that we have put into this thing, due to the amount of training and the sheer size of it. And what that allows us to do is to defer responsibility. Being a human and being the person who pulled the trigger on, say, bombing a girls' school, we assume most people will probably feel bad about killing 100 girls, right? Presumably. But if you can say, it's not my fault, it's the tool, it's the software, it's the artificial intelligence, it's the machine's fault, you can go to sleep at night, maybe. And deferring responsibility from humans who are assumed to be faulty to machines which are assumed to be, not faulty, or if they are faulty, it's outside of our purview, outside of our capabilities to recognize. That is a very important tool for states. It's the next level of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy has to sort of defer individual responsibility into some kind of tool, which can be helpful and can be bad. And I would say that is probably one of the darker aspects of why AI tools are so tempting to states right now, because they allow to, perpetuate systemic cruelty, systemic oppression, and so forth, without any recourse to responsibility, and making it very hard for people who are fighting against that oppression to make proper arguments, because you need to argue with a black box, which is kind of hard. So what we have as a result here is we have highly addictive chatbots that are made more addictive and dangerous to individuals, but are probably not making enough money as it is. We have software writing tools and stuff like that, which is sometimes profitable, or sometimes beneficial to people using it, but once again, not necessarily something that is making enough money right now for the larger models to be profitable. And we have a state that might be willing to pay more for this stuff, but it's so far also not exactly making any of these companies fully profitable. So we need to ask one big question here, with all the capabilities that these tools have that make them interesting. What can be done by smaller models? A lot of this can just be done by smaller models, so why are we still doing the thing? Why are we building ever bigger machines, putting more and more and more and more money into this stuff? That's what we need to talk about in the next part, and I have to tell you, it's the economy. And it's stupid. So, what do Judas Priest and the Silicon Valley AI bubble have in common? Well, they're led by gay men, and their success is built on breaking the law. Unfortunately, we have to talk about AI and can't talk about heavy metal today. So let's talk about Silicon Valley and venture capital. Well, this is the part where we talk about venture capital, innovation funding, and why all of the things going on right now might be a dangerous bubble. One thing first, this is a general exploration. This is structural analysis, that kind of stuff. For the day-to-day updates on the situation, I would recommend reading the Where's Your Ed At newsletter by Ed Zitron, or listen to his Better Offline podcast, or check out any of the other people doing that kind of analysis. We can't do this here. The second part is, of course, that we have to do several things in this specific section, which is look at how venture capital funding works, why all the things that make venture capital the thing it is are really, really dangerous when combined with the specifics of the AI bubble, and while all of this is structural, we still need to pay attention to the individuals running this thing at the end. So that's what we'll have to go through here. Well, this section is once again based on a number of sources. These are, when it comes to the AI specific stuff, once again, it's Empire of AI by Karen Howe, and it's very much the Reverse Centaur's Guide to Life After AI by Cory Doctorow. When it comes to the startup part of all of this, I would highly recommend reading Behind the Startup by Benjamin Shostakovsky, which is a big source for this and covers how venture capital does shape innovation by investing in individual startups. Shostakovsky has worked at a startup and is an anthropologist, so he has experienced this and also has the toolkit to actually analyze it. Highly recommend this one. When it comes to venture capital, this book is very much based on, unfortunately, The Power Law by Sebastian Mallaby, which is a good book written by a bad person. Mallaby is, he's the Paul Volcker's Fellow of International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations, and that should raise all the warning flags you can imagine. And he does write history, but it's more hagiography. So he really believes that venture capital is a good thing, and he'll make you believe that as well. So you have to read this book against the grain, but he has access to people that other writers don't have. So it is unfortunately a really good history of, venture capital funding. It's also based on World Eaters by Catherine Bracey, which does also cover the current impact of venture capital. It's based on More Money Than God about hedge funds, once again by Sebastian Mallaby, and it's based on Bad Company by Megan Greenfeld, which is, about private equity, the same as The Asset Class by Hattie O'Brien, which is also about private equity, which are, the other investors in the current situation. It's also based on The Entrepreneurial State by Mariana Mazzucato, which covers the transfer of knowledge, innovation, and so forth from state funding to private enterprise, and why that may be sometimes not the best thing to do. It's a good book, but Mazzucato clearly believes that capitalism is the best way of organizing our economy, and, I disagree, so I have some quibbles with that book, but it's still very good. It's also based on Techno-Feudalism by Yanis Varoufakis, to look at the larger issues around that. So that's most of the sources for this specific section. Let's get into it. How do we, in fact, make inventions, and what does it take to make an invention? Well, basically, inventions and innovation take three things. They take knowledge, they take time, and they take money. Knowledge, because you need to figure out what to do. Time, because you need time to actually turn your idea into something that you can then share with the world. And money, because, you need to live. And possibly you need to buy stuff to build the thing that you then want to share with the world. That's the three main things that you need. Obviously, there's overlap. So let's talk about knowledge first. There are two big theories on how we combine knowledge with innovation. One is the classic Enlightenment idea coming from Francis Bacon's New Organon, and behind that, which is we do science, we understand the world, and then from that knowledge we derive individual inventions that we can use. And then there's the other way, which is, fuck around and find out, which is you build stuff, you tinker, and once you've built something that works, you then come up with, the explanations on why it works. And that has oftentimes been the more successful route. Famously, the steam engine was built by engineers who didn't know anything about thermodynamics, because thermodynamics weren't really explored at the time. So once we had the steam engine, we could start figuring out how, thermodynamics work. What I'm saying here is that there is a sort of interplay between tinkering and actual, academia on the other hand. This goes into the next part, which is, where does knowledge come from? How do we create knowledge? Now, when it comes to science, to academia, well, it's tax funded, right? You have people who sit at universities who do research, and they are paid by taxes mostly. That is one way of creating that kind of knowledge. When it comes to tinkering, that's oftentimes more a private enterprise. And the interesting thing here is that those two are in tension, and depending on who you ask, they will prefer one side over the other. The other thing is that the more complex our knowledge of the world becomes, the more important the theoretical work is when it comes to building, machines afterwards, right? So the pendulum has slowly shifted from the fuck around and find out stage to the, let's have a think about this before we start doing stuff. This is really important. The next part is, of course, who creates that knowledge, and is there something going on there? See, knowledge is oftentimes process knowledge. People do stuff all day long, and then you take that knowledge, you synthesize it into something afterwards. In fact, you expropriate that knowledge. This can be very hands-on when we look at, steam looms and all of those inventions of the Industrial Revolution. Individuals went around and watched weavers and cutters and all the other people that you need to, make textiles in 18th century England, watched what they did, and then tried to build machines that could replicate those kind of movements in one way or another. They did expropriate the process knowledge of those individual craftsmen and then turned it into machines that could then be used to pressure the workers, the craftsmen, into becoming simple laborers and all of those things that we see coming after that. A similar process is obviously also going on in academia, where a lot of research is done by assistants, PhD students, and so forth, who are usually getting very little money, having to work insane hours and so forth. And then at the end, the boss of a specific research group will put their name on the invention. Now, this is usually how that goes. So once again, there is a form of expropriation happening. This is really important. The final part is, of course, that shift of taking inventions and innovations and research that is currently done with state funding and then shifting it to private enterprise to explore it more. Now, there is an argument to be made here that, private companies might be better at turning knowledge into products that they can then sell. The question is, does the state get anything from that? When we talk about AI, this is really important. See, the inventions that led to large language models and deep learning and so forth, they were made, among others, by Geoff Hinton, who now has a Nobel Prize and all of those things, and his research group at, I think it was Toronto, a Canadian university. And then once they had won the ImageNet competition, they spun the thing out, turned it into a company, sold it to Google, and then Ilya Sutskever moved over to OpenAI, and after, losing there, he went to somewhere else and so forth. So we see that sort of generating knowledge with tax money and moving it into private enterprise afterwards. So this is how innovations happen. Now, the second part, the time part and the money part, we can kind of combine because you need money to have the time and so forth. In the olden days, so to speak, it was independently wealthy people who became inventors, right? The people who built the first steam loom and the first steam frame and all of those wonderful machines, they already had money, so they could spend time watching craftsmen do their work, and then fiddle around with machinery, build the machinery, and then use that money they already had to, invest in building factories and so forth. You can't start necessarily becoming a capitalist with no capital to start with, right? That's something we see. Same goes for Charles Babbage, who built the Difference Center. The man was independently wealthy. He could afford to fuck around. This is obviously not a good way to run an economy in the long run, although we are kind of getting back to that. So what happens if you need to invest a lot more and you don't have that many independently wealthy people sitting around who can't just afford to, do this for years in the hopes that something comes out of it? You need some way of funding inventions and innovation on a grand scale. You could just have the state invest in stuff, and that might work, or you could have private money do that. This is where where venture capital funding comes in the 1950s in particular. So, venture capital, how does it work, and why did it work so well for tech innovation? Venture capital, which is short for adventure capital, which kind of tells you that it's all about gambling. Well, how it works is you have a venture capital firm, which is consists of some general partners. These are the big names that invest in stuff and decide where to put the money. And you have limited partners. Limited partners just give money to the general investors, to the general partners to do with as they please. The investment firm then puts together a fund, a venture capital fund, which means, they raise money, they ask people to give them money, and this fund is limited by time. It goes like, well, in 5 years, we'll, take all of this money again, and we'll split it up according to, how much you put in share-wise, right? That's how a venture capital fund works. So the general partners then have, a lot of money to play with, and they find likely companies they think might become really big in the future, and they give them money in exchange for shares of that company. These are private companies who are not yet traded on the stock market. These are people who have an idea and want to build a product or whatever to then become big entrepreneurs, big company owners afterwards. That's kind of the goal. So you have basically people who have the right to gamble with a lot of money in the hopes of, helping people to build new inventions. That's the fundamental model of venture capital. There are several things that we need to talk about here that are important. One is that venture capitalists, in exchange for money and shares in a company, very often do get board seats and thus some kind of control over the companies they are investing in. Obviously, they have an interest in making this company as successful as possible. So this kind of makes sense. This is the first part. The second part is to ask who actually might be those silent partners who give a lot of money to general investors, general partners in a venture capital firm to fuck around with. Yeah, there are obviously wealthy individuals. They could put money in there. Then there are university endowments. They can, take that money, invest it there, and hopefully this will then go back to making the university a better place to do research and thus, build a cycle there. Now we can argue how successful that is when it comes to the specific types of universities who are doing this, but, that's one thing. Then there is the question, who else should do this? Because, once again, this is, somewhat risky. You are basically gambling in the hopes that some of these new companies will become big afterwards. So for the longest time, for example, pension funds were not allowed to do this. This was called the prudent man rule, which means, pensions maybe don't gamble with this. Then some people from the Chicago School of Economics, massive assholes, a lot of them, convinced Ronald Reagan, massive asshole, to maybe cut that out and, make it possible for pension funds to invest in venture capital, which is what happened in the 1980s. At the same time, obviously, the capital gains tax was slashed massively, so it became very lucrative to invest in these venture capital funds, venture capital firms for everyone basically. Is this good? I don't know. Then there are obviously banks, right? Banks have lots of money. Now, after banks gambled a lot with money in the 1920s and all of this came crashing down in 1929, there was a law called the Glass-Steagall Act, which basically said that banks can gamble with some money, but not with the money they take from individual customers. There has to be a separation between investment banking and customer banking. To make sure that your money is kind of safe and you can get your money back from the bank, no matter what happens otherwise. Then some massive assholes from the Chicago School of Economics convinced, in this case, Bill Clinton, and once again, massive asshole, to maybe stop that. And the Glass-Steagall Act was dropped in the 1990s, late 1990s, to make it possible for banks to gamble with even more money. Was that good? Well, absolutely, it led to the 2008 bubble, didn't it? So yeah, good thing all around. So you have pension funds and investment banking, but also banks using all their money to potentially pour into this venture capital thing to make money. A final group that we need to talk about quickly is, of course, sovereign wealth funds from other nations. The Saudi sovereign wealth fund is heavily invested in different venture capital firms, SoftBank in particular. Same goes for the United Arab Emirates and other such vehicles. Now, why am I bringing this particular thing up? Well, remember what I said about VCs often getting board seats and steering innovation? Well, obviously, those limited partners can't really choose the investment. But if the Saudi Foreign Wealth Fund has heavily invested in a tech company through a venture capital firm, and that venture capital firm has some way of controlling the direction of that tech company, there could be problems there, is what I'm saying. I'm not alleging anything. I'm just saying there are conflicts of interest potentially down the road. So, now that we know how venture capital works, why is this kind of difficult for the current AI bubble? Well, see, over time, venture capital moved from investing in all kinds of innovations more and more into software. The reason being, software is cheap to produce, right? You have like 10 white dudes in their 20s in San Francisco who get paid a lot in usually shares and equity in the company and maybe some money and so forth. And then the rest is done by click workers in the global south. So it's very cheap to produce that, which makes it a relatively safe investment because you don't necessarily need to put a lot of money in. If you put a lot of money in, that money can be used for all kinds of things like, expanding market places, advertisement and so forth to make the company very popular versus to actually build the product, because building the actual product is very cheap. In fact, this led to a big boom in software in the 1990s and mostly in the 2000s and 2010s. One of the more annoying venture capitalists, that being Mark Andreessen, even said software is eating the world. He might be wrong about that, like so many other things because he's Mark Andreessen, but that certainly felt right for venture capitalists at the time. So the move to software. The next important part here is, of course, AI is not a software business, right? AI does write, AI companies do write some software, by which I mean, a couple of lines of code to, create the individual models and so forth. But most of the stuff needed for AI is hardware-based, right? You need to acquire data, which you can do by breaking the law. You need to build massive data centers to run all of these machines. That costs a lot of money. So AI companies do not need the money to, advertise their product, but to actually build their product. They are not software businesses. But venture capitalists have, looked at this as if it was software. This will be a problem in the future, I assume. Right. So the next part of why all of this right now doesn't really work that well is something called the power law. The power law is basically, if you invest in a lot of startups, most of those will fail. But if one of them becomes incredibly successful after 5 years, that success can cover all the other losses. So you basically, as a venture capitalist, you need to find at least one really big success in each batch of stuff you invest in for each fund to make the whole thing work. You don't need to gamble only, you need to actually make sure that you have at least one big win. How do you create those big wins, right? How do you create those unicorns, so to speak? Well, beyond, just storytelling, and we'll get there, the main thing of becoming this highly rated, this highly successful and so forth, is to either find a completely new marketplace, a new market, and take it over, or to disrupt an existing market and once again take it over. But the goal is to become a monopoly. The tactic for doing this is called blitzscaling, because yes, tech guys really love words that are kind of tied to, well, Nazis, I guess. So yeah, blitzscaling means to become a monopoly by spending as much money as possible to outbid the entire competition. This is really well when you work with software, because you can spend all that venture capital money to do exactly that. Peter Thiel, another one of those really bad venture capital assholes, and all-around assholes, really, said competition is for losers. So the goal really is to build a monopoly here. So this is another thing that is going on right now, where we have several AI companies who are building large language models, all in the hopes of becoming that monopoly, for which they need a lot of money. All right, the final part is, how do venture capitalists actually make money? Well, they get those shares in companies which they can't sell until that company either, gets sold to another company or goes public, which means, get listed on a public stock market, has an initial public offering, an IPO. At that point, they can sell all their shares, hopefully for way more money than, they put in the beginning. Now, how does stock price, how is stock price calculated? We need to talk about something here which is called the price to earnings ratio, right? The price to earnings ratio means that people are buying stocks, not necessarily for the dividend that is paid out to each shareholder every year from, how much, a company makes by, selling stuff, but you buy stocks in the hopes of selling them for more money in the future. You hope that the company that you buy stocks in, that you buy shares in, will become bigger and more successful in the future. You bet on the future. So the higher a stock price is, means the more people expect this company to be bigger in the future. How do you make people believe that? Well, by telling them stories, right? So all of this boils down to big narrations and narratives in the future, which is where all of these laws once again come in. Because, tech bros love laws. They don't understand them, but we kind of need to talk about that. All right, so first law that everyone loves is Moore's Law. Sam Altman famously wrote an essay talking about Moore's Law forever. Moore's Law is, named after Gordon Moore. He, was president, CEO of Intel, and he discovered that at the time, computing power grew exponentially, right? Every 18 months, the number of circuits you could put on 1 square inch of silicon doubled, which is really cool. And he's like, well, if we assume this is a law, then we can basically predict how powerful computers will be in the future. That's Moore's Law. Another law that everyone loved for a while in AI specifically is scaling laws. See, OpenAI figured out that if you make your artificial neural network larger, and if you increase the number of, the amount of data you feed into it, and if you increase the amount of training and so forth, the performance will also, be better exponentially. They called it scaling laws. They tried it from GPT-2 to GPT-3. It worked. They tried it from GPT-3 to GPT-4. It kind of still worked. They tried it with GPT-4 to GPT-5, and it didn't work anymore. Which is part of the problem with all of these laws, why they break. See, there's a difference between prescriptive laws, and descriptive laws. If we talk about descriptive laws, like, a lot of like physics and natural science, we like, well, this is how the world works. That describes the world. Prescriptive laws are the kind of laws that tell you what you have to do, right? It's the kind of laws that your country has, which, tells you don't kill people, that kind of stuff, right? These are prescriptive laws. Moore's Law is often seen as a descriptive law, the same as the scaling laws, but they are not. They are prescriptive laws. See, there is no natural law that says computing power will grow exponentially. It grows exponentially if you spend a lot of money on research and development. And in fact, you need to spend more and more and more money to still keep to that specific growth. It's a prescriptive law. And, obviously Moore's Law has slowly failed. It held for a long time because Intel and other chip makers poured insane amounts of money in research and development to stick to that law. Scaling laws, once again, prescriptive laws. You need to increase these things to get that result, and you need to spend more and more and more to keep that growth going. On the other hand, and this is the important part when it comes to share price, to company evaluation, telling people about these laws is wonderful storytelling. You basically tell them, this is where we will be going, and that's just the law. Which is where the whole superintelligence thing comes in, because while, AI may not be working right now, we kind of know it will be getting better and better and better as long as you keep pouring money in. And at some point, we'll just reach superintelligence. Don't worry about it. We'll talk about what it means and what superintelligence is in the next section. All right, so this is why this is sort of like what is going on with the AI bubble. Now, why is everyone pouring in so much money? There's a couple of final things that we need to talk about here. One part is ZIRP. ZIRP is the zero interest rate policy that happened after the economic collapse in 2007 and 2008, which means people got a lot of money from the state for basically zero interest to keep banks running. Now, obviously, banks, being prudent and all of that, took all of that money and poured it into venture capital and invested it heavily. So for the longest time, venture capital firms have had more and more and more and more money to play with. They put all of that money into all kinds of technology, but because they need that big slam dunk in the future, what they did was hope for another market to disrupt. This worked well in the 2000s, and it kind of stopped working because there's not that many markets left. There's not that many things left to do. And after the smartphone and after social media and all of those big companies went public, they looked for new things. They thought cryptocurrency might be it. They thought that NFTs might be it. And now they think that AI might be the thing. They might go and think that quantum computing is the thing after the AI bubble, but that's how it works. They are desperately looking for some place to put all that money in. The next problem is, of course, that the more money you put in to something, because you need those 100-fold returns afterwards to pay for all the other stuff that you invested in that didn't pan out. If the higher the evaluation of that company needs to go, and since everyone has put all of their liquid cash into these AI companies, there is an upper limit to where this will be going. This is one reason of why this is a bubble, right? It has to pop at some point. The other part is obviously that, the product doesn't work. We kind of know that as well. So 2 or 3 final things before we can move to why all of these people are Nazis. So I've talked about structures here, but we also need to talk about something else. That something else is why we have to actually look at individuals. We already talked about it. Storytelling is really important, and storytelling loves heroes, loves individuals. That's one part. The other part is structural. See, every venture capital firm has general partners. These are the big men who make the decisions, who are, somewhere in the spotlight and so forth. So we need to look at them because they make individual choices where to invest money, how to deal with individual companies and so forth. These are your Mark Andreessens, your Peter Thiels, and so forth. However, tech companies also go that way. From Google onwards, there has been something happening that kind of mirrors the structure of venture capital. See, if you have shares in a company, you have voting rights according to how many shares you have in a company, right? Well, no longer with these kind of companies. See, they have developed a several-tiered structure for shares, which means that owners like Sergey Brin and Larry Page with Google, or later Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook Meta, have so-called super voting shares. So each share you have that is a super voting share counts for 10 normal shares or 100 normal shares, which gives those individuals outsized control over a company in one way or another. Once again, this kind of mirrors the structure of the venture capital fund with limited partners and general partners. This means that we need to actually pay attention to those individual founders who then run their companies because, Mark Zuckerberg decides what happens with Facebook, and he can't do that because of the way he has those numbers. So we need to actually pay attention to what these people believe. All right, one final thing here is about, regulatory capture, because there is a sort of like thing that comes with becoming a monopoly, right? Which means you want to keep being the monopoly. How do you do that? Well, you move fast and you break things. You go into a new place, you ignore the laws if they exist, and you, you skirt around places that don't have like full written laws yet, until you have taken that monopoly position, and then you talk to, you settle all the lawsuits that might be out there, because you now have the monopoly position, you can basically dictate prices now, everything. And you talk to, lawmakers and go like, hey, look, we're the experts on this specific thing, so we're going to help you make sure this will actually be regulated. And you use that regulation to make it impossible for newer competitors to actually compete with you. Facebook was, for a while, really in favor of very detailed community moderation and making that a law because, Facebook has the money to pay those click workers in the global south. A new social network probably doesn't have the money to spend on that, so they can't even, get to the place where they could become competition. This is something that is already happening with AI right now when, Congress asked how do we maybe regulate artificial intelligence. Well, who did they ask for suggestions? Well, Sam Altman, of course. And this is, once again, really important. these people, by virtue of the storytelling that comes around, venture capital, that comes around the way we have turned our economy into gambling according to stories, these are seen as individuals who can solve all of these problems, which is why we really need to talk about those individuals and what they believe. Because there is basically two stories with AI, right? One is, well, we'll build the machine, it will become super intelligent, it will turn us all into paperclips unless we do something about it. And there is the other story, which is, well, it's an interesting tech problem, an interesting technology. We haven't found a way to actually make it work as a product, but we're telling this story because, it's what keeps the share price up. So the question is, are these people grifters, or are these people, true believers in AI? Now, I would argue that there are some people in there who are very much grifters and would, happily play with any other computer technology or any other innovation to make money. But there are also others, and we need to take them seriously, even though I would argue superintelligence is not going to happen anytime soon. We need to pay attention to what they believe, what superintelligence is, how it works, and what they want to do with it. Turns out all of that is also really bad, and that's what we have to talk about next, which is, of course, it's a Nazi project. If someone who talks about intelligence and IQ is racist, does that make someone talking about superintelligence super racist? I think it just might. So let's talk about AI slavery and racism. Cheers. Alright, this is going to be the next important segment where we will be talking about the underlying ideologies and theories and concepts of intelligence that hide behind the term artificial intelligence right now. We have established that, it is just a new form of machine learning and extracting value and knowledge from labor. It has a lot of limits, and it doesn't have, any workable, financially viable products so far, but it has been turned into a large bubble because of the specific way that venture capital funding interacts and intersects with Silicon Valley and the specific demands of large language models and artificial neural networks. We now have to look at what the people who are doing this believe and the story they tell. Now, I have mentioned before that this is, we can't actually decide which of these people does 100% believe the things they say and how many of them are using this just as a story to, raise shareholder value, or in this case, just pump up the value of their specific company, hopefully to have, a big IPO or other form of cash out. We can't fully know that, and I'll personally have suspicions of some of these people in one direction or the other, but we need to take the story seriously, because as long as some of them believe it, and because of the way that the specific technologies are set up, that will still lead to a dark outcome. So this segment is based on a number of texts. As primary sources, I have very much read, and I don't recommend you do that, I have read Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom. It's a key text, and we'll talk about it in some detail. Once again, I don't recommend you read this unless you want to understand what a lot of Nazis believe, right? The second book by Nick Bostrom that I've read for this is, of course, Deep Utopia, Finding Meaning in a Solved World, and I hope you keep an eye on that word solved here. It's a bit dark. So these are texts written by Nick Bostrom, one of the key figures and key thinkers and philosophers, so to speak, in the larger current AI model discussion. It's been especially superintelligence has been held up as an influential text by people like Peter Thiel, Sam Altman, Bill Gates, and so many more. So that's why I've read them, and we'll talk about them in detail. It also is based on another group of texts. One of them is The Conscious Mind by David Chalmers, which, looks at ideas and theories of consciousness. Another one is God, Human, Animal, Machine by Megan O'Giblin, which, looks at the sort of religious connotations of a lot of this conversation. Then there are What Tech Calls Thinking by Adrian Daub and there is More Everything Forever by Adam Becker. Those last two are mostly focused on the sort of like ideas that a lot of the people involved in Silicon Valley have on like a grander scale, and their approach to intellectual labor, or their inability to do any of those things. This is also very much based on, and if you only read one text, I highly recommend you read this specific one. It's a short paper. It's called The TESCREAL Bundle: Eugenics and the Promise of Utopia Through Artificial General Intelligence by Timnit Gebru and Emil Torres. These are people who really know what they're doing. Timnit Gebru was a AI worker at Google, got fired for that famous paper on the dangers of stochastic parrots, and is heavily involved in, all the issues of the current AI situation. Highly recommend this paper. If you only read one text, this is the one. It's also based on a number of other books. In this case, texts on libertarianism by Quinn Slobodian. In this case, that is, of course, Crack Up Capitalism, Hayek's Bastards, and Globalists. It's also based on Muskism, a book, a guide for the perplexed, by Ben Tarnoff and Quinn Slobodian on the specifics of Elon Musk's approach, and in, comparison to that other tech billionaire's approach to, capturing the state and other elements. It's also based on Gilded Rage by Jacob Silverman, which follows a lot of the sort of like right-wing turn, if there ever was one, by a lot of Silicon Valley billionaires. It's also based on Hubris Maximus by Faiz Siddiqui, which follows, once again, Elon Musk in a lot of ways, and compares his approach to, some of the other tech billionaires, and I think there are value lessons to be learned. It's also based on The Contrarian by Max Chafkin, which is a biography of Peter Thiel. And that is most of the main text. There are others that have sort of like been there in the background, but we can probably get a good idea from these ones. So how are we going to go through this? Well, we're going to start with a look at what intelligence might be, or isn't. Then we'll look at Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom in particular, the sort of like playbook it lays out, and then we'll tie that to the larger underlying ideologies, and from there move to the very specific, more primitive racist beliefs of and ideologies of some of the big players in Silicon Valley right now, and how that ties towards, their idea of the type of stories they want to tell. That's the program. So let's start with the big question. What is intelligence? Well, turns out we don't know. There is no fundamental definition of intelligence. There are all kinds of different definitions of intelligence all over the place, but science as a whole has never decided or has never agreed on a fundamental definition of intelligence, which is a bit of a bother if you want to then find out what artificial intelligence might be. This is really important to keep in mind from the beginning. So over time, when talking about artificial intelligence, computer scientists have made do with all kinds of working definitions. One is narrow artificial intelligence, which is usually saying this is a computer program that can solve a very specific subset of problems. And after a while, they also came up with the term artificial general intelligence. Put a pin into that general intelligence, but mostly understand that it is the current goal of companies like OpenAI and so forth. They have tried to come up with definitions, and the working definition for OpenAI is machines that can surpass humans in most or all economically viable tasks. This is going to be really important because it doesn't actually say anything about intelligence, but reduces intelligence to, economic value. This will become a bit of a problem later on. And then from there on, there is the step to superintelligence, or general superintelligence, or whatever you want to call it, artificial superintelligence, which is just, artificial intelligence, or in this case artificial general intelligence, turned up to 11, or beyond that in any way possible. So that's the definitions we work with here. So please, the one thing you need to take away from this, there is no definition of intelligence, and therefore there is no way of measuring intelligence. There are things like IQ, And they measure something, but that something is not intelligence, but something that was made up by people. And we'll get there. So, with that set out, let's look at Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom for a second. A book that came out in 2014 and was read by a lot of people. It was cited by Sam Altman, by Elon Musk, by Bill Gates, by Peter Thiel, and many others as sort of the thing that sort of like made them think about artificial intelligence in a new way and gave some level of urgency to their project of creating artificial intelligence and keeping it aligned. This is also something we'll come back to in a moment, right? So what does Nick Bostrom basically do in that book? Well, a lot of very poor philosophy, to put it mildly, a lot of big number stuff, and a lot of guessing. So the basic point of Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom is that there is a high probability, or if you look at a long enough time frame, a certainty that we will create a machine intelligence that is going to become more and more and more and more intelligent and surpass humans very quickly, and then turn, the entire universe into a place that is very different from anything we could possibly imagine. That is the fundamental point. And if that is a certainty, we need to worry about what that superintelligence would be like and where, that would leave us as humans. Now, Nick Bostrom posits that we need to worry about this, and we need to make sure that the final superintelligence will be properly aligned to make sure that, there is a space for humans, and that superintelligence will serve humans and not, destroy us. That is the fundamental basic point of superintelligence. There are several individual points, though, that I want to point out before we move on, and I hope I will not say point all the time. The first part is, when looking at superintelligence as something that is, beyond human intelligence right now, Nick Bostrom doesn't actually define intelligence either, because, how could he? What he does, however, is like, well, we assume intelligence is, what humans have in a way that separates us from any other animal because we have more of it. If we want to surpass that level with humans, there are all kinds of ways we could get there, and he just makes up a couple of options, right? We create machine intelligence that will just become better and better and better and better. That's the artificial intelligence. Or we upload human minds into machines and thus emulate human minds and put them on hardware that is faster than the human brain, and thus we will reach, superintelligence. And then there's, of course, another option, which is, of course, you take humans that are fairly smart and you deliberately breed for higher intelligence over time. Now, he accepts that might have to clear some political and moral hurdles, but he brings up the idea of, selective breeding for intelligence. Put a pin into that. There's a term for that, right? So these are the ways that he decides we could potentially increase the intelligence and thus create this superintelligence. The next important thing that I found interesting is what happens once we have reached that. And there we come to the sort of economic value, because he assumes that, we can create all kinds of ways of, superintelligences that will serve humanity. The way they do that is, of course, by, doing all the jobs that we can't do or don't want to and so forth. And they can obviously be very cheap, if not basically for free, because if they run on machines, we can just start up another intelligence by the click of a button. We can copy them again and again and again. Now, he argues that they might have consciousness, and therefore this might be a bit iffy, maybe, but he hand waves that with the idea that, well, it's machine intelligence, so it's not the same as human intelligence, and of course we can put them into simulated places and simulated environments where they will be happy doing the work for nothing. This is still slavery, though, and he does sort of acknowledge that and just hand waves it away with, well, it's machine slavery, so where's the big problem, right? This is kind of troubling. The next step is his idea that if we do create superintelligence, this will automatically lead to us slowly moving out into space, conquering space, finding more and more places for these intelligences, for both human intelligences and superhuman intelligences and superintelligence, to take over the entire universe. You might say we might need something called Lebensraum, or living space, for that. This is very much the underlying idea. He brings up a couple of examples there, one being the O'Neill cylinder, the other obviously being the Dyson sphere. The O'Neill cylinder I just mentioned because it ties back to something that we will talk about later. And then finally, he talks about the idea of alignment and the way to make sure that if we create this superintelligence, it will not, and he brings up that example that you've heard so many times, turn us all into paperclips because we didn't actually make sure that the AI superintelligence will work properly and understands what it's supposed to do. So he brings up this idea of us, everyone being turned into paperclips. And to avoid that, we need to find a way to train it properly, to align it towards human values and to align it to human-friendly values in one way or another. And he brings up different options of how we could do this. The main point here that I want to bring up, though, is the idea that he assumes that there is a correct set of human values. Now, where this will go is something that we might have to talk about in some detail later. All right, so this is Superintelligence, and this is the book that everyone thought was the best book ever on artificial intelligence. It doesn't have anything serious in there. Its arguments are usually non-existent and are covered by making up incredibly large numbers and going like, well, this is possible, this is likely. Also, if we assume that there will be millions of years of humans living longer, and then we have so many people, and then so forth. He tries to create the semblance of seriousness by adding large numbers and making it look more like science than, just the ramblings of a stoned first-year kid in college. That's a bit of a problem, and we'll have to come back to that later. But, let's look at those sort of like ideas that he has packed in there that I've just pointed out. Let's talk about the first one about, raising intelligence in one way or another. Uploading brains is a bit of a sci-fi idea. Creating a computer from scratch that will do all of those things, it's a bit of a sci-fi idea. Selectively breeding humans has a long tradition and is called eugenics. Yes. And that is something that has a long tradition, and calling it, well, there might be some moral and political hurdles to overcome is selling this short. Now, obviously, eugenics has been around since the 19th century in its contemporary form. Obviously, you have the idea of selective breeding all the way back to someone like Plato's Republic and so forth. But, what with the rise of modern biology, evolutionary theory, and so forth, people like Francis Galton and so forth decided that we might apply all of those things actively to humanity and make sure that humanity gets better and better and better by making sure that we sort of nudge evolution consciously in one way or another. And there are two ways of doing that. One is obviously negative eugenics, which means, all the wonderful things of preventing people that we don't want to have kids from having kids. You can move that forward into the 1930s and 40s in Germany, where it ends with, well, just killing everyone who is considered to be unworthy of life. Useless eaters was the terminology that the Nazis used for that. Or you could just sterilize people you don't want to have kids, and that's something that the United States have done all the way into the 1970s. Yeah, so negative eugenics have been around for a long time. The other version is, of course, positive eugenics, which is the thing that Nick Bostrom does present here, which is, if we have two very smart people, let's make sure that they will have more kids. And those will probably be smarter again and again and again. Now, the first important thing to understand here is this assumes that intelligence, whatever intelligence might be, is hereditary and is, defined by genetics and not by anything else. That is a huge assumption, and one that is very much tied to, well, racism in a lot of ways. It is also not borne out by anything else. So this is where we come back to the idea of IQ for a second, right? See, IQ as a measurement, or intelligence quotient as a measurement for intelligence, was very specifically, very quickly used and utilized in ways that were, very much meant to make sure that we know that certain groups of people are more intelligent than others. This is obviously because the tests were built in a very specific way, ask for and check for specific knowledge that people from specific backgrounds have and other people don't have. That's how you build an IQ test. And they are tied to racism and eugenics from the very beginning. And there is no way to get out of that. All right, so is that the only reason why this is all, borderline racist? Well, of course not. Obviously, We know that Nick Bostrom is racist in other ways, because he did in fact write about this in the 1990s on a extropian email list where he mentioned that he believes that blacks are less intelligent than whites. That's him saying that, not me saying that. He also used the N-word. He apologized for using the N-word. He never walked back his idea that, people of certain skin colors are more or less intelligent. So he does actively believe in the racist version of eugenics here. The other part with the positive level of eugenics is, of course, that a lot of people have, had ideas about that. There were, there was the idea or proposal to have a sperm bank from only Nobel Prize winners, for example. And there are obviously billionaires or millionaires, multimillionaires, who think that or thought that because of their brilliance, they should probably have as many offspring as possible. One of those was Jeffrey Epstein, who, would you believe it, did in fact fund Nick Bostrom's institute in Oxford. So there you have that connection. So yeah, this idea is fundamentally eugenicist. There is, however, something more here that we need to look at, right? See, when I talked about the connectionist model in the second section of this video, I mentioned where Frank Rosenblatt got his start and where he got his methods from. He got them from someone named Spearman. Spearman was a eugenicist. A lot of statistics is tied to eugenics because a lot of statistical methods were in fact developed to do eugenics. Now that doesn't invalidate these methods, but it's important to understand that. And Rosenblatt in particular got his start in something called psychometry, which is once again building tests to sort people into specific groups according to personality traits and so forth, which is the next step away from sorting people into specific groups according to their test results and calling that IQ. So the large language model, the underlying system of the artificial neural network, is based on eugenicist ideas and methods developed by eugenicists who thought that this is a way to go. This is also interesting to see because a lot of these ideas come from Stanford, and we'll come back to that in a second. Stanford is a bit of a, eugenics hotspot and has been for a long time. So, let's move on from that to the AI slavery second point, right? As I said, Nick Bostrom talks about the idea that we can, obviously, once we have created these super intelligent agents, we can spin them up and spin them down and use them and so forth. And while he assumes they might have, some form of consciousness, that doesn't really count because we can make sure that they will still be sort of happy. This is interesting because it once again reduces an intelligence that has consciousness of one form of another, no matter how you define it. It reduces that to its economic value, which is interesting when we tie that back to OpenAI's definition of artificial general intelligence as a machine that surpasses humans at most or all economically valuable tasks. So that reduction to economic value is tied in from the start. And if you combine that with the IQ conversation, there's a very clear idea that depending on your intelligence value, you can be used for specific tasks and not paid for that. That's racist slavery. That's something the US in particular has a bit of a history with, right? So yeah, I think it's important to understand that element and tie it back into that. So let's move on from that to the idea of, those values that we need to align with. And there is something interesting happening here. Now, keep in mind, I've not mentioned this often enough throughout this video so far. All of these conversations are happening in the United States of America. This is very specific when it comes to these values. While, Nick Bostrom is Swedish, worked in Oxford in the UK, his sort of followers and the people building these machines right now, they are all in the United States. They are applying very specific US-centric values to their AIs. So what do these people actually believe? That's where we come to that wonderful concept, the TESC-REAL bundle. That's a weird acronym, and we can't go into all the details. It stands for transhumanism, extropianism, singularism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism. basically, this is a whole bundle of people who believe that it is the goal of humanity to surpass its current sort of like capabilities, speed up energy consumption, conquer the known universe, and find one way or another to either meld with machines or, become machines in one way or another. That's that whole sort of bundle. And if you combine that, once again, overcoming humanity as it is right now, that's eugenicist. When it comes to conquering the known universe, that's colonialist. That's, once again, your idea of finding Lebensraum. That's pretty fascist, to put it mildly. And that's the people who decide what makes a artificial superintelligence that we will not be able to build with the machines that we have right now. And I hope I've made this clear throughout this video so far, but that's the story they're telling. That's the values they want to align that system with. So it will make sure that, humans will become smarter, faster, better, and so forth in one way or another according to their ideals, which are tied very specifically to genetics and to ethnicity, skin color, etc. And to then conquer the world and conquer space for them to spread out. That is the underlying idea. It's very much a Nazi idea. So, we have all of this. Will this work? Obviously, no. But it is still important to understand that, because that's the story that they are selling. And that's the story that the people who are currently funding artificial intelligence have bought. So are they all Nazis? Well, the answer is, once again, those who take this seriously, kinda. And those who just grift because they need to tell a story to raise the evaluation of, say, OpenAI, they're at least accepting this specific narrative, this very clearly racist, eugenicist, and fascist narrative. But we need to look at one thing before we can go into the details here, and that's the danger of the conversation about superintelligence. See, what Nick Bostrom does and what other people have done since then is, of course, warn us against a wrongly aligned, ill-aligned, whatever you want to call it, superintelligence that will take over the world. And they assume that this will be the ultimate danger, the biggest risk that humanity is facing right now. It's a very catchy story, and we have a lot of media that sort of supports it, we've all seen, Terminator. But by focusing on that specific thing, to the exception of everything else, that gives them a way to not think about the real harm that these AI products, large language models, right now are causing. That gives them a way to not think about, people talking to chatbots and then committing suicide. That gives them a way not to talk about or think too much about the idea of, AI prediction tools used for predictive policing and the likes being racist or being sexist. These things can be hand-waved. It gives them a way to not talk about, the climate impact of building larger and larger data centers and so forth. Because once we've reached, once we've built that superintelligence, either it will work for us and then we'll solve all of our problems because we basically built God, whom we've then enslaved, or, we've built God who will kill us all, and that's the one thing we need to talk about. Which ties back to the thing that I said earlier, right? Become the dominant player in a field, and then you can, in fact, reach regulatory capture. And when you see what people like Sam Altman and so forth are talking about in Congress and the likes, when it comes to AI regulation, that is the thing that they are building on. That's the thing they are mentioning, right? We need to make sure that we don't accidentally build the machine that will destroy the world. And by focusing all the attention on that, they can get away with all the other crimes, all the other breaking of laws that they are constantly engaging in. Which once again ties back to the whole thing being very US-centric, because obviously they have engaged in a lot of xenophobia, making sure that the US gets this because the US is the good state, and we need to make sure that China doesn't get it, which is once again a way of regulatory capture to avoid regulation to any of the current problems of artificial intelligence in lieu of this weird future sci-fi story. So yeah. With all of that said, let's look at the people who do maybe take all of this seriously, even though it is a blatantly racist, eugenicist project. Are all of these people racist? Well, a lot of them are. That's kind of the problem, right? And this is sort of where things get very interesting. We need to talk about Elon Musk, but we also need to talk about a lot of the others. Elon Musk is just a good bridge here, because, see, Elon Musk has very specifically said that he built his artificial intelligence, that being Grok AI, to make sure that it is not going to be a woke AI. See, even with the kind of alignment that is just based on the regular task reel sort of like bundle of values, he's not happy with that because it is not racist enough, because that's kind of what he wants. And we've seen that with Grok becoming Mecha Hitler. That is a very deliberate choice. Now, if you assume that these people are serious about the idea that they are building the machine god, it should be kind of disturbing that most of them want the machine god to be already moderately racist towards and moderately white supremacist, and other people who are definitely believing part of these things are, well, trying to turn it into Mecha Hitler, as we all famously know. Now, this is one part here. The next part, I think, is interesting, though, with this, and that is, where does this need to build that machine god come from with people who are wanting to do this right now? Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, a lot of these people are displaying something very interesting, and that is a bit of a hero complex. They assume that this thing will be real, that we will create superintelligence, and we need to make sure that superintelligence is going to work. But they also want to be the ones who build this. Elon Musk doesn't want to save the world because he wants to save the world, but he wants him to be the person who wants to save the world. And that complex can be seen with people like Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen and a bunch of these tech billionaires in one way or another, because they believe themselves to be superior in one way or another. And that might be tied to their ability to make a lot of money. It is probably also tied to their sort of like identity as white men. Let's not forget that. For a surprising number of them, it's also tied to growing up in South Africa, that being Peter Thiel, David Sachs, Elon Musk. The number goes on, which is famously was we're talking apartheid South Africa in the 1980s here, right? So there is that racial component in there fundamentally from the beginning. And with that understanding that they are special, better than the rest, comes something that has happened in the last couple of years, which is a feeling of entitlement and a feeling of, being insulted and not valued enough. Mark Andreessen famously has talked about this in the past when he said that there was a deal, which is, the US state lets Silicon Valley do whatever the fuck they want, and they'll pay some moderate amount of taxes, and that's it. And as soon as, the Biden administration, for example, started regulating big tech for very good reasons, they felt betrayed. And they did not just felt betrayed for, business reasons, but on a personal level, because their greatness, their ability to save humanity, their hero status was suddenly questioned, which all moved them further to the far right. So that's where we end up with a lot of these people not only, using sort of like subconscious racist biases or anything of the sort, but actively courting this, leaning into that specific form of racism. The reason I'm bringing this up is that we need to tie all of this to the type of stories they are not only believing, but the types of stories they are telling. Because, as you may or may not know, when we talk about artificial intelligence, we use metaphors, we use examples from media, we use a lot of science fiction. And if you have read a lot of science fiction, you may or may not know that, their interpretation of science fiction is often somewhat idiosyncratic. And that is tied to them being white supremacists. This is what we need to talk about next when we talk about, the alt-right in science fiction. Did you know that nerds are superior to other people, especially when they're white? Well, that's what Nazis believe, and they wouldn't lie. So let's talk about speculative whiteness and artificial intelligence. Cheers. In this part, I want to examine one final big step, and that is science fiction literature and movies and media and how it ties into the current artificial intelligence bubble, and the way that the people behind said bubble and venture capital are utilizing it and are seeing themselves within it, because that is a key component of where we are, mostly because, well, we are using science fiction terminology to talk about artificial intelligence in a lot of cases. So we should examine that. This part is based on a number of texts, once again. A big one here is Speculative, Whiteness, Science Fiction and the Alt-Right by Jordan S. Carroll. I highly recommend reading this one. It even has an open access version, so you don't even have to give money to it. And it won a World Fantasy Award, so there's that. Anyway, it is also based on Astounding by Alec Nival-Ali, which is a fantastic history of John W. Campbell's stewardship of the Astounding science fiction magazine, and writers like Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein, and L. Ron Hubbard. It is also once again based on, well, More Everything Forever by Adam Becker, which covers a lot of the science fiction influences as well, and it is once again based on Adrian Dobbs' What Tech Calls Thinking, and of course once again on, well, The Contrarian by Max Chafkin as a biography of Peter Thiel, and, well, both Muskism by Quinn Slobodian and Ben Tarnoff, and Hubris Maximus by Fi Siddiqui as biographies of Elon Musk. It is also once again based in part on Crack Up Capitalism, Globalists, and most importantly Hayek's Bastards by Quinn Slobodian, as histories of libertarianism, neoliberalism, and how those tie into racism, and surprisingly often into science fiction as well. So let's go through all of this one step at a time. And the first thing we need to notice is there's an awful lot of sci-fi and fantasy references in, well, tech at the moment, aren't there? Now, everyone knows Palantir as, well, the Seeing Stones from Lord of the Rings. Peter Thiel has a whole obsession with Lord of the Rings metaphors. He also has Narya Capital, he has Valar Capital, and so forth, Valar Ventures, and so forth. He just loves to use terminology from Lord of the Rings, and he has been very open about his love for Lord of the Rings. On the other hand, we have Elon Musk, who has named his AI chatbot Grok, which is a terminology from Robert A. Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land novel, and there are obviously others, and Elon Musk has spent a lot of time talking about science fiction. He has compared the Cybertruck to a vehicle that the Blade Runner would drive, which is, you know, a whole other mess we'll come back to. He has openly talked about loving Ian M. Banks' Culture series, which is once again very interesting. And, well, Peter Thiel has talked about science fiction as a big inspiration, in particular the classics from the 1950s. So we kind of see the fingerprints of science fiction and fantasy literature all over the current group of, well, both inventors or innovators, if you want to call them that, or at least founders of tech startups and their funders in venture capital. Now, does that have an impact on what they think and how they think, and should we maybe examine that? And that is a very interesting sort of thing to look at when we look at the history of science fiction fandom in one way or another. Now, just to be clear, fandom has been very, very multicultural forever, especially when it comes to fan labor, writing fan fiction and so forth. A lot of this has been done by marginalized groups, in particular, obviously, because a lot of science fiction and fantasy media did not represent them, so they made up their own stories. That is something you can find all the way back when fandom started. I'm not talking about this. I'm mostly talking about very specific parts of mainstream fan culture in one way or another. And I think this is really interesting to look at. So the first important thing that we need to look at here is that from like very early beginnings on, fantasy and in particular science fiction nerds have thought of themselves as smarter than everyone else. This is something we see in the letters that were written to science fiction magazines in the 1930s and 40s. It's something that we see in fan discourse throughout the 1940s, 50s, and so on, in meetups and so forth. This sometimes becomes very openly white supremacist and racist and weird, all the way to plans of having the smartest science fiction fans move to a compound somewhere in the Ozarks and making sure that they have very smart kids and so forth. So this is out there, but it is also an underlying idea that we see represented by people like Robert A. Heinlein in speeches and so forth. So there is an underlying idea that nerds are smarter than everyone else. This obviously has been pushed again and again and again all the way to today, sometimes in a more comedic way, but it's a stereotype that is in there. And as you may have noticed, a lot of these nerds are white. Most of them are usually depicted white, or people who think of themselves as smarter than everyone else. They are also very much white. Now, why is this? See, this is where we need to talk about a very specific type of racist idea that ties all of this together. There is an underlying, a very old idea that white people, in particular Northern European people, are smarter than other groups of humans for reasons of climate. Now, climate theories of racism are weird, have been around forever. And the argument is that because people living in the global north, in particular in Northern Europe, have to spend more time planning ahead because the climate is rougher and you need to make sure that you have enough food for the winter and so forth. They have developed the trait of looking into the future in one way or another. This is obviously bullshit, but it has stuck around and comes up from time to time and is oftentimes referenced. So this means that the idea that white people, in this specific way, northern white people, are predisposed, or possibly the only part of humanity that is able to think long-term into the future, into the far future. In fact, there are actual speeches by Robert A. Heinlein talking about the idea that science fiction nerds, fans, are the only people who are not able to just think ahead in for a century, but able to think ahead and plan ahead for thousands of years. If this rings long-termism, as we talked about in the previous section as part of the Test Real bundle, yeah, that's true. And there's no big secret that people like Nick Bostrom also reference a lot of science fiction in their work from time to time. And in particular, his second big book, Deep Utopia, reads like someone who really desperately would love to write science fiction, but can't do so, and instead is just poorly copying ideas from Ian M. Banks. So this is a very interesting aspect to the idea that there is a form of long-term thinking that only white people have because of, climate reasons. Once again, this is bullshit, but it has been around for a while, and if we look at, people like Elon Musk and the likes, we can see them having very much imbibed this in one way or another, whether explicitly or implicitly. And with that specific trait of being able to think ahead into the future comes a second trait that is tied to that in those narratives, which is, of course, that white people who plan ahead and live in rougher climate, they need to be builders. They need to, build houses because you can't just sleep out in the snow, I guess. Whereas people in other parts of the globe can just laze around every day. Once again, anthropologically, this is absolute bullshit, and we know that. I just need to reiterate that every single time because someone might come up and go isn't this really true? No, it's not. But the idea that these people are builders and they are creators that are driving the entirety of the world forward, that are creating the systems that other parts of humanity can then rely on and subsist on. That is a narrative that you find tied to that both in science fiction and in, white supremacist rhetoric and in racist rhetoric all over the place. It's, Stephen Miller right now, last year at Charlie Kirk's funeral, talking about the builders of society and so forth, right? It's that. It's also Farnham's Freehold by Robert A. Heinlein, which has white geniuses that are kept as slaves by a lazy black class of people that are also cannibals, right? This is very much out in the open in a very specific type of science fiction. And now that we've established all of this, it shouldn't come as a surprise that this is then once again tied to, intelligence as measured by IQ, because it's a wonderful number that you can put in there and then use to justify anything. It's also, at that point, an engineering problem, because if there is a number, we can then try to optimize that number. That is the underlying idea that is tied into all of this. And science fiction is full of, stories that explain or explore how you might, in fact, be able to increase that intelligence, that IQ. So this is where we have tied this specific type of science fiction to white supremacy. Is that accidental? And is it accidental that people like Peter Thiel are very much in love with classic science fiction and assume that everything that came afterwards is not worth reading? Well, no, because see, a lot of this was shaped by editor and author John W. Campbell. He's famous for writing one short story that was turned into the movie The Thing, and beyond that he was editor-in-chief of Astounding magazine and shaped the careers of people like Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and so on. Clearly, it cannot be overstated how much impact and influence this man had on science fiction from the late 30s all the way into the 1950s. He's also a founding member of, well, not Scientology, but Dianetics, the thing that L. Ron Hubbard did before Scientology, and helped connect L. Ron Hubbard to, or tried to connect him to, Claude Shannon and Warren McCulloch of, the McCulloch-Pitts unit and information theory that we talked about in the early chapters of AI. Funny how these things are constantly tied together, but once again, this is a group of people that believes, in a transhumanist way almost, that, we should be able to improve our human capacity, and because of their very specific form of racism, that being in particular John W. Campbell, I have no idea where Claude Shannon or McCulloch stood on that thing. I don't know and I don't care, but W. Campbell was very explicitly racist. We know that from the kind of stories that he deliberately pushed, and he was very much trying to publish stories that would shape humanity, that would shape America in particular, that would push towards, the development of nuclear weapons, US domination, and so forth. But he was also very clearly racist and sexist towards women, and in particularly black people. We also know that he was also somewhat anti-Semitic. And we know that from people and stories that he rejected, authors that became very popular later on, and that had to deal with this man. Ray Bradbury, not a big favorite of John W. Campbell's, among others. So there is a very specific element here. These stories are very much embody very much the type of thinking, the racist, white supremacist type of thinking that people like Peter Thiel have embodied or already, had instilled in them by their parents and their upbringing. Peter Thiel famously comes from a very weird right-wing evangelical Christian German family that moved to the US and moved then to South African occupied apartheid Namibia, which probably doesn't help with, becoming a stable person. So there's one reason why these people love these specific stories, and it's very easy to read those stories and decide that you are part of a chosen elite that should, through that transhumanism, once again, which is tied to the TESCREAL bundle, right, should create and should look further into the future, because you are able to and you need to make sure that there is a future for white children. Yeah, David Lane also a big sci-fi fan, and this is one side of this. There is, of course, another side of this, which is, of course, is what do you do with stories that don't fully fit this? Now, Elon Musk, famous for really weird readings of science fiction stories and of media in particular. Peter Thiel, very much the same. Famously, he said that he didn't like Star Trek because it was communist, and he liked Star Wars because it was capitalist, which that's not what happens in Star Wars. George Lucas has famously said that the first Star Wars movie is very much inspired by the Vietnam War, and the rebels are not in fact, rebels of capitalism fighting against a socialist authoritarian state, but are in fact the Viet Cong. But Peter Thiel is misreading it in that specific way. Elon Musk famously thinks that he really loves the culture novels by Iain M. Banks. Iain M. Banks being a utopian socialist, writing about a far future, a post-scarcity far future where capitalism has been disbanded, and there is, no money. In fact, Banks is very clear about the existence of money being seen as a sign of a backward civilization. That is something that Elon Musk is very willing to ignore and overlook. And we see this once again and again. Now, what is happening here is, of course, that there is such a thing as death of the reader, death of the author, right? Every reader can read a text in whatever way they want. And this can get, lead to really weird contortions with very clear, explicitly political texts like some science fiction. And it obviously leads to the willingness or ability to just ignore forms of irony and subversion, which are once again tools in science fiction. There is also another part that is really interesting and important here, and that is science fiction as a map for the future. Science fiction is not a map for the future. Science fiction, as authors like Ursula K. Le Guin have said, is about the present. It is a look at the world right now, and reflecting that. They don't predict the future; they describe the present. But white supremacists, with their understanding that they are smarter than everyone else, and they are predestined to actually, move forward and build a future for their very specific IQ-derived form of elite, they look at these texts and see them as roadmaps of where to go, which is, a way of doing this that can become rather problematic in the long run. The other part is, as I said, active misreading. And that is something that we can see move from these stories from the 1950s, that we can see from the focus on very talented supermen that you find in particular in Robert Heinlein's more libertarian approach to science fiction, that you can see in Ayn Rand's novels, which are once again also science fiction in one way or another, and that you can see even sort of like in some elements of libertarianism that is tied into that. People like Hans Werner Hoppe in particular, who is the current leader of the Mont-Pelerin Society, or he used to be, and is very much the leader of libertarianism and neoliberalism at the radical fringe here. Once again, tying both IQ and Charles Murray of the Bell Curve, also part of the libertarian movement here, tying IQ to building and to very specific types of race, and seeing these people as ahead of others, building this temporality in it, where some people are already in the future and should just make sure that, they stay in the future and there is a future, a further future for them. With all of that, what we see is, with that libertarian element tied into it, a focus on the individual, even beyond just the white race, so to speak. And that is where stuff gets really interesting, which is why these people want stories of individuals saving the world in one way or another. And as we've seen in the previous section, that is how they think of themselves. Elon Musk does not do these things because he wants to save the white race, but he wants to do these things because he thinks of himself as the person who saves the white race. And the same goes for a lot of others of these people. Fun aside, they don't actually really hide any of that, because, this look at the future has been a fascist thing all the way from the past, from the early 20th century, when the futurists wrote the Futurist Manifesto, and the same people who wrote the Futurist Manifesto later wrote the Fascist Manifesto, became supporters of Mussolini and so forth. And, wouldn't you know it, Mark Andreessen quotes the Futurist Manifesto in his Techno-Optimist Manifesto, where he talks about effective accelerationism. So there is a very clear open strain of this, even outside of the fictional aspects of science fiction, with that look towards the future and the prediction of the future. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with a lot of people that have a lot of power, that have read a lot of science fiction, have correctly read some of the most abominable white supremacist parts of science fiction, and are, because of their already established ideological framework, misreading other parts of science fiction. Famously, they are using the very eugenicist depiction of society in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World as a description of the reality that we live in right now, calling some people epsilons and alphas and so forth according to their IQ. Now, what is important to understand is, obviously Aldous Huxley, not a eugenicist, really not in favor of that specific society. Brave New World, famously a dystopia. On the other hand, his brother, Julian Huxley, president of the Eugenics Society, very much in favor of all of this. Just a nice thing to know on the side. What I want to look at, however, is this misreading where it leads people, because it often ends up in eugenics. A final one here that I want to bring up is Dune. See, a lot of people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk love Dune and think it's really good. They are misreading it, obviously, with focus on Paul Atreides. Paul Atreides is, for them, actually a good hero, a superhero, the one that you need to be, that you need to aspire to. What is interesting here is, of course, that Paul Atreides is the result of a eugenics program. That is exactly what it is. And people like Elon Musk would identify themselves with Paul Atreides. Or, well, in a weird twist, Grimes, his ex-partner, has described that she thought that X, their son, Elon Musk's and Grimes' son, was in fact Paul Atreides, and he's going to be this super being. They are reading these texts as, well, roadmaps towards the future. So this is important because it shapes how they think of themselves and how they think of the technologies that they are creating and the world that they are creating. Building a computer god that they can enslave and that will help them achieve their dreams of conquering space for a white race, that will make them the masters of said universe, is part of that. The other part is, of course, that with this specific technology that they are building, they are very much trying to shape reality. On the very banal level, they are trying to use these misreadings to shape our reality and use these narratives to explain where we are going, how all of this is inevitable, and so forth. That's, why people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos buy media outlets, take them over to, spread specific narratives. You just have to go on Twitter, X, the Everything app, and look at what is going on there, the way media discourse is shaped there. This is one part of this, of shaping reality. The next part is, of course, artificial intelligence. See, on the one hand, artificial intelligence, generative AI in particular right now, is very much used, described in terms of science fiction. Predictive policing and the likes in AI systems is compared to Minority Report. Once again, not a story that tells you that this is a good thing, but it is described in those terms. When describing evil AI or dark, dangerous AI, wrongly unaligned AI that will destroy humanity, Terminators are suddenly appearing. For whatever reason, and I just want to bring this one up with the Blade Runner, Elon Musk, for whatever reason, thinking that Blade Runner is a good character. Well, first of all, Blade Runner is not the name. His name is Becker. Blade Runner is a job description. And what the Blade Runners, in fact, are, well, they're slave patrols. They need to find AI slaves, in this case, replicants, androids, whatever you want to call them, and eliminate them. That's the kind of character that Elon Musk thinks is the hero of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and Blade Runner. That is interesting. So they are using this technology as, using science fiction and their misreadings, which they spread through their access to media, to shape the world for an acceptance of artificial intelligence technology. At the same time, they're also using artificial intelligence technology to shape reality, spreading falsehood, creating artworks. Well, artworks is wrong, but creating media that represents the future they imagine in a way that, artists would probably never do, because that's not possible, or that's not what most individuals would want to do, especially if they, went through a large sort of like art training where you have to look at individual influences and value them. Artificial intelligence, in this case, generative AI, does short-circuit that, because it allows them to just create the world they want to live in. And because obviously these systems are trained on more data and more data and more data, by seeding these narratives, creating all of this false representation of the world with the AI technologies under their control, they will make sure that these will become more and more the only reality that we can perceive if we ask Google, if we use Google search and look at the AI description summary. Well, that's not the reality that really exists. That's reality. These people, through their misreadings of science fiction and their white supremacist underlying ideals, are shaping slowly. And that, I think, is really bad. Which brings us to the actual end of this very long look at the current artificial intelligence bubble. And we just have to find one final thing, and that is, of course, what now? So, after over a year of work and over 3.5 hours of video, it's time to wrap this all up and ask ourselves, what have we learned and what can we do about it? So, let's do that. Cheers. Well, throughout this entire video, which has taken a lot of work and a lot of time for you to watch, and I do appreciate that, I have tried to show several things. Mainly that having individual conversations about whether it's okay to use AI art, or whether AI art is theft, or on the other hand, whether AI is, burning the planet, or whether AI is coming for your jobs, or even if, AI is going to take over the planet and turn us all into paperclips, how all of these individual conversations are interesting, but don't ever cover the whole thing, because all of this is connected as part of a larger project. That is what I've tried to show. And, well, if you've paid attention, what hopefully you have learned, and I hopefully conveyed correctly, is that at its core, artificial intelligence is an automation technique, and as automation, its goal is to expropriate knowledge and thus power from labor and shift it towards the owners of capital. This will, well, make it harder for people to bargain for better working conditions and so forth, and, well, give even more power to capitalists. At the same time, it will allow the users of artificial intelligence to hide their responsibilities behind the supposed black box of a machine that is, well, that you can't argue with. It does, in this way, further the project of bureaucracy by making it even more illegible than bureaucracy already is. This is the second part, and that's where, using technology from either Anthropic or Palantir or anyone else to bomb girls' schools in Iran kind of comes in. It's a machine that did it, so we don't have to worry about it. That's the second project here. The third project that I try to explain here is, of course, that by shifting AI research from academia to private companies, we expropriated taxpayer-funded research and turn it into a product. By having the underlying incentives of VC-funded AI development, everyone has focused on one specific technology, that being large language models, and all other AI research has basically been stopped for now, which, if the goal is to create better artificial intelligence, whatever that may be, is actually really bad, because large language models seem to be a bit of a dead end. I've hopefully also tried to manage to tell you how these machines actually work, which hopefully allows you to see the limits of these models. And I've tried to explain what the price for these limits is, which is, both immiseration of people working to make these machines work, and of course, the environmental cost of all of this. That's one first part that I've hopefully shown you. The second part is how all of this has turned into an economic bubble because of the way that venture capital funding does, well, pull all of the liquid assets of the larger US market in particular into one technology in the hopes of actually making it big, hopes that will very, very likely, almost certainly, be squashed very quickly, and that will lead to, well, this entire bubble slowly bursting. I've hopefully also shown you that because of the way that big tech has set up its structures ever since the early 2000s, once again through the help of venture capital, we are in fact beholden to a very small number of individuals who have outsized control over these individual companies, which means we have to focus on what all of these people believe. And I've hopefully shown you that a lot of these people believe right-wing white supremacist ideologies and, well, yeah, not to put too fine a point of it, racist ideas. I've hopefully shown you how this has led to a very specific way that artificial intelligence right now is a eugenicist, racist project with the goal of establishing fundamental control over our world, reality, and so forth by a small, mostly white, mostly male elite of people who think that they are already one step ahead of the rest of humanity and hope to stay there with the goal of conquering space through their very specific offspring. Finally, I've hopefully shown you that science fiction as a media form has shaped our understanding of artificial intelligence as a technology, and how the people who are currently steering, for what it's worth, of the AI bubble are using their control of the media and their white supremacist readings of science fiction to shape that science fiction discourse, to once again shape our understanding of that technology, all once again with the goal of, well, taking over everything. Whether that will work is obviously another question. And that obviously leaves us with one very big question, which is, of course, what can we do about it? And that's obviously a long sort of like question, and I can't answer that fully. But I figured I'll give you a couple of sort of like things that I feel we can all do, from the very small things to the relatively big things, because obviously the biggest one here is dismantle capitalism. And we will see how we get there, but let's start with the small things. First of all, inform yourself, read more. Now, I know that it is important to read and your current news and stay up with what is going on day to day, especially if you are, for better or worse, invested in the stock market through your retirement funds or anything of the sorts, because, well, this is a bubble and this bubble will burst. And I think it is important to do that. But I also want to tell you that I think it is even more important to step back from time to time and read actual books. I have, well, read a lot of books for this video, around 30, I guess, at least. And I've tried to point you towards some that I think are worthwhile, but like any of the books down there in the description, in the bibliography, are worth reading, depending on what you want to find out. And I highly urge you to step back and read some of those, because journalistic media, if it's not independent media, which follows algorithmic demands of the platforms that, you know, independent journalists are forced to use, if it's actually legacy media, is once again beholden to capital. In specific, it is beholden to the type of capital that is tied to venture capital and big tech. Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, for example, right? These people have vested interests, and these will shape the depiction of artificial intelligence, the discussion of artificial intelligence. At the same time, AI companies open, you know, and associated big tech, TESCREAL associated funds are creating opinions. They are deliberately steering the conversation towards superintelligence to, well, keep everyone away from the real harm that AI is doing right now. And they will push these kind of narratives into the media. So day-to-day media will not actually give you a good understanding of what is going on. Once again, I highly urge you to, you know, follow people like Cal Newport or Gary Marcus or Ed Zitron and so forth to get your daily updates of what is going on. But I once again think you should also go and read some books. Maybe start with Karen Howe's Empire of AI, which does give you a lot of information on what is going on, but also has a lot of the details that are, you know, tied to OpenAI. In fact, to show what's going on, the difference between newspapers and current journalism and books, if you had read Empire of AI last year, you would not have been surprised by the Ronan Farrow article on the, lies of Sam Altman, because all of the things that make Sam Altman untrustworthy, all of this has been written down by Karen Howe in Empire of AI. So yeah, go back, read some books, read Empire of AI or read Atlas of AI. Maybe also read some books like Cory Doctorow's The Reverse Centaur's Guide to a Life After AI. Do some of that stuff. Read books, because they are much more dense in information. They can lead you to further books and actually educate you much more than, you know, current journalism. That is the first step. The next step is, if you don't have to use AI, don't use it. Now let me qualify that, right? If you find a very specific large language model tool that works for one specific thing that you need to do for whatever reason, then maybe use it. But question every time you use something like that, do I really have to? Can I do this in a different way? And if you have to use it, and if you agree that you have to do that, well, then try to find an open source model. Try to find, more importantly, an open source model that ideally runs on your computer. In that way, you are not, in fact, you know, burning too much energy, burning too much natural resources because your model is running on some data center somewhere in the global south or in, well, I guess Texas or Arizona, right? This is really important. If you have to use it, you know, carefully and consciously. That's the next part. The next part is, how do you deal with people who are using AI right now? There are several things. The main important thing, however, is organize, unionize. One of the big things is, of course, that we can individually make choices, but the big lie that neoliberalism has been telling us for the last 50, 60 years is that we are all individually responsible for everything that happens to us. That is not true. The world runs as a system. We are dependent on others. And if we have numbers, then we can change things. So organize. If you are someone who, has to deal with artificial intelligence in your job, unionize. Join a union, start a union, do all of those things. If you are someone who is in some other way suffering from the impacted by artificial intelligence use, find other people that are in the same situation, organize with them, talk to them, find strategies together. When it comes to being a consumer of products that have artificial intelligence shoved into them, once again, organize. And to be clear, be structured about it. When it comes to the book market in particular, we have heard of, some authors using AI in one way or another. But unless these are self-published authors, if these are, traditionally published authors, it may not be the choice of the author. It will probably be the choice of the publisher. What that means is, if you want to protest that, well, protest the entire, output of that publisher, even if they are publishing some of your favorite authors. This is where review bombing can actually help. But don't just review bomb one specific, book. Review bomb everything. Boycott them and make them understand why you are doing it. Be loud and be clear about it. This is a structural thing. This is something that a business has decided. When it comes to individual authors using artificial AI, when it comes to self-published authors in particular, understand that these might be choices made out of economic pressure. So try to find and try to build structures that make it possible for people who don't want to use AI to not use AI and still get a result. I don't know. If you're an author and you are not sure if you can afford a cover artist, if you can afford an editor and so forth, I don't know, make this very clear. And if you can and are interested in a book, pre-order it. Give those artists money in advance so they know that they can actually afford the investment of asking humans to do the jobs that humans could do. That's one way of doing this. Now, the next part I think is really difficult, and let's talk about shaming. We need to shame some people here. Unfortunately, and Dr. Fatima recently made a good video about that. Shaming can backfire. So here's what I would say. If it comes to people sharing and posting self-created AI memes on the internet and so forth, shame them as much as you want. Insult them, do whatever you want. That is the type of gratuitous AI use that is not necessary. When it comes to people telling you that they have used AI for something specific, well, ask them why they did it, understand what they're doing, and maybe show them alternatives. That is much more important here. When it comes to shaming, however, here's where the focus on individuals and the sort of leaving behind of deeper structures in capitalism that venture capital and Silicon Valley have gone through really comes on, because a lot of these people are incredibly insecure. If you have the chance, insult Mark Andreessen. Tell him that his head looks stupid. He will absolutely feel that. Elon Musk, one of the most insecure people on the planet. Will it change the future much? No, but these people are evil, and it may give you a little hope or a little, spike of joy that you made someone else miserable who has made the entire planet suffer. I think that is fine. Direct your ire towards those people, not individuals who have no choice or felt that they had no choice but to use AI somewhere. Beyond that, get organized, get involved. Are you living in a place that is currently, in danger of having a data center built next to them? Well, get involved in protest, get involved in local politics. Make sure that you don't want these things there, because even if AI works, data centers suck. We all know that, and it's already a big thing. So make sure that you deal with that. Get organized is, as I said, the main thing here. When it comes to elections, also make it very clear that you are not supporting people or politicians that believe in a very specific form of AI future. And finally, once you have informed yourself and you find people on social media talking bullshit about AI, fear-mongering about superintelligence turning us all into paperclips, all of that kind of stuff. Mock them. Either ignore them, or if you can't, or they're too big, well, mock them, point out where they're wrong. Look at what kind of people they're talking to. Look at where they get their information from, because chances are it's an AI-funded group that talks about AI safety, by which I mean, well, obviously, superintelligence or fear of superintelligence, instead of, using, making sure these machines don't turn us into idiots and turn us into paranoid people who commit suicide or anything of the sorts. Make sure you point that out, because we need to make sure that we have a better conversation about artificial intelligence. That's what I've tried to do here, to give you an understanding of what is possible, what is not possible, and where these things are going. And finally, the big one. Keep in mind, these are products. These are software tools. Nothing else. There is no sentience there. Even though we are, prone to assume that anything that talks very close to human natural might be as, have the same level of intelligence as us, it doesn't. It's a machine. It doesn't even do anything. It produces outputs according to inputs. Keep that in mind and, be pedantic about it. Also, if you use it for something helpful, like, text summary or whatever, double check. Don't ever use it for search. It's not a search tool. It cannot search. Use alternatives to Google, as long as Google is only giving you AI summaries. Make sure that you get your information from actually trusted sources. And yeah, that's, I think, all we can do beyond, dismantle capitalism, start a revolution, the big ones, right? Obviously, I'm right there with you for all of those, but they may take a bit of time. Yeah, so that's that. And here at the end, I just want to say thank you. If you have made it this far, I do really appreciate it. This has been a hard video to make. I started, researching last year in May. I've read so many books on this. I reread so many of them. I've given it so many starts. I have recorded so many, each part so many times throughout this. I've had scars, I've, healed scars, gotten new scars, knocked out a tooth, got a new tooth, knocked out a different tooth, got a new tooth, lost my pendant, things have changed. I'm a very different person right now, and I want to say thank you for watching this. I do really appreciate this. If you've, been here for the whole ride, thanks for reminding me to keep going. Thanks for telling me, hey, we're still waiting for this video. Thanks for keeping me, on the ball here, because I was close to stopping this. I was close to giving up so many fucking times. I do really appreciate that. And if you're new here, well, I hope you've learned something. I hope you don't feel like I've wasted your time, and maybe I'll see you for something else in the future. For now, all that's left is to ask you to, tell me what you feel about it. There's a comment section down below. Do stuff there if you want. You can press some buttons. There's subscribe buttons, there's like buttons, there's ways of giving me money if you feel that I've earned it. Patreon, a direct sort of PayPal link. You can join this YouTube channel. You're not getting anything extra because I'm really bad with paywalls and stuff like that. I do, however, appreciate all of this. Anyway, the final thing that is left to say is go read good books, and more importantly, be good people. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, thanks and cheers.